Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is let's start this from the beginning in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 66, The Hideout I. Let's start this from the beginning. The Hideout I. Then, in a puff of white smoke, Kakashi-sensei suddenly appeared next to them. Well, he said in a painfully upbeat tone, that sure could have gone much better. However, it also could have gone much worse. None of you was hurt, right? Some of those attacks came awfully close. Judging by the expressions on Team 7's faces, the mood was made even worse by his arrival. Itachi, having known Kakashi many years now, could see the slight annoyance behind his mask, both the physical and the metaphorical one, and apparently, so could the genin of Team 7. He was clearly just as unhappy with the few close calls towards the end of the fight as Itachi. However, his brother and his teammates clearly had other priorities at the moment. Sakura was the first one to find her voice. "Sensei. What are you doing here?" "Yeah." Naruto immediately followed up. "Didn't you say you have some very important and even more dangerous Jonin stuff to do?" Kakashi scratched the back of his head, his expression the epitome of innocence. "Well, I did, but I fortunately finished that just in time to see the end of your fight." Much to Itachi's surprise, it was Hinata who spoke up next. "But weren't you watching the entire time from that nearby tree, Kakashi-sensei?" The simultaneous exclamation of "what?" from all members of Team 7 would have been rather amusing if it weren't for the fact that its volume hurt his ears. That was only a secondary concern for him right now, though. Much more curious was that Hinata of all people had gone out of her way to cause trouble, and Itachi had no doubt that it hadn't been just an accident that she let that information slip. She was smart enough to realize that Kakashi had wanted to observe his team without them knowing. It was rather out of character for her to intentionally pour oil on the flames like this. One glance at her face was enough to explain the situation, however. "Ah," Itachi thought with a hint of amusement, "I see. She's still annoyed with them, isn't she?" Those near misses had been as much his team's fault as Kakashi's, but it was only natural to try and shift the blame to others. Especially for a genin. There was nothing malicious about it, of course. Only immaturity. In Hinata's case, she was probably more upset about her teammates almost getting hit than about nearly getting hit herself, but the end result was the same. His amusement over the situation was faint, and he made sure that none of it showed on his face, but while that might have been enough to stop any of the genin from noticing, Kakashi clearly did. "Anyway," the other man said, interrupting his student's rant that he had probably not even truly been listening to before turning around, "we haven't even properly greeted our friends here. You should probably thank them for their help, too, don't you think?" Naruto and Sakura did just that and bowed, although it was very obvious that they were reluctant to do so. While most of their displeasure was still focused on their sensei, they were clearly just as cross with Itachi's team as his team was with them. Sasuke, on the other hand, barely inclined his head, let alone actually bowed. "I don't see why we should thank them," he muttered just loud enough for everyone to hear. "We were doing just fine before they arrived. If anything, we only started to get problems after they showed up." Kiba scoffed before anyone else had the chance to reply. "Oh yeah? And whose fault is it that you guys got so distracted this easily? Don't blame us for your own incompetence." Coming from the person who constantly jumped in front of attacks from his supposed allies, "That's hilarious," Sasuke replied. "If you had just stayed back and watched, nothing of that sort would have happened. So if you were in our position and saw another team from Konoha fight a group of unknown enemies, you wouldn't help but rather stand back and watch." Shino spoke up, his voice uncharacteristic cold. "What a fine shinobi you are." Sakura took a step forward to stand next to Sasuke, arms crossed in front of her. "Jumping into a fight blind is stupid. You should at the very least have verified the situation first." "Exactly," Naruto exclaimed as he came to stand next to his two teammates. "If you had done that, you would have seen that we didn't need your help at all." Kiba followed their example and went to stand next to Shino, closely followed by Hinata, resulting in both groups standing face to face with each other. "Who says we didn't?" the former said, a challenging tone in his voice. "Maybe we did and simply decided you were about to be killed, eh? Ever thought about that?" We dash. Deciding that this had gone on long enough, Itaka loudly cleared his throat just as Kakashi slammed his book shut with an audible thud. Immediately, all 6 of the genin fell silent. Now then, Kakashi said amiably, as interesting as that was, this might not really be the best timing for a fight between friends, so if you could refrain from doing so for now, that would be great. Itaka nodded. I agree. Instead, we should first look for a place that is less vulnerable than this one. Oh, it's we now? Does that mean that you intend to hang around for much longer? He raised a quizzical eyebrow at Kakashi's remark. He was reasonably sure the other man wasn't truly against them staying with them, and considering both Konoha's policy for situations like this as well as Kakashi's personal stance on not abandoning his comrades, it wouldn't really make sense if he were. So why would he? Oh, he thought with sudden realization, he wouldn't still be upset about that, would he? Kakashi, he said in a mixture of exasperation and, although he tried his best to hide it, amusement, please don't tell me this is about what I think this is. And what would that be? In response to the dry answer, which was Kakashi's attempt to play ignorant, Itaka just gave him an unimpressed look. Neither said anything for several seconds after that, waiting for the other to break their silence first, but before that could happen, Sasuke suddenly addressed Itaka for the first time since their arrival, his curiosity about what they were talking about apparently winning out over his usual insistence about acting as independent and unruffled as possible around him, at least when others were with them, that is. What did you do, Itaki? Itaki instead of Nii-san, huh? Well, I asked another Jonin a while ago for our 2 teams to hold a joint training session, you see. You 3 surely remember, don't you? The last part was directed at his own students, and he only continued after they nodded their agreement. The aforementioned Jonin was Might Guy, and in return for training with us, he asked me for a favor. And how does that have anything to do with Kakashi-sensei? He didn't bother to suppress his smile while Kakashi let out an audible sigh. Guy just so happens to be Kakashi's self-proclaimed eternal rival and dash. Wait a minute. Sakura interrupted him, her eyes wide and any hostility she might have felt before forgotten. The Might Guy? The Taijutsu specialist. At his nod, she whirled around to look at her own sensei. You're his rival? A metaphorical cloud of despair hung over Kakashi's head as he replied. Well, as Itaka just said, he's technically my self-proclaimed rival, so dash. That's so cool. Tsunade-sensei once said he's the only one in the village whose taijutsu she acknowledges as even better than hers. For a moment, Itaka was confused as to why she referred to Tsunade as her sensei, but then he remembered that Sasuke had once mentioned that she was one of the students who took part in the training program that the hospital offered for academy students, and his confusion subsided. Why didn't you say anything about that, sensei? Wait, what do you mean this guy's? Heh, that's a good one. Taijutsu is even better than Tsunade's. Naruto exclaimed in surprise. How can that be possible? Ero Sennin told me that she's just as strong as he is. Itaka chuckled. For all that Tsunade-sama is one of the village's strongest fighters, the field she truly excels in is medical ninjutsu. Might Guy, on the other hand, is a close combat specialist, so it's not unreasonable for his taijutsu to be better than hers. Anyway, Sasuke spoke up before either of his teammates could say anything else while simultaneously throwing them a dark look to make sure they didn't interrupt him. You still didn't say what this all has to do with Kakashi-sensei. What kind of favor did this guy ask of you? Somehow, Kakashi's mood fell even further, but Itaka didn't let that deter him. Guy usually challenges Kakashi to all sorts of fights all the time, but recently, he somehow managed to successfully avoid him, so he asked me to help him find Kakashi in order to issue another challenge. The disappointment was clear on not only Sasuke's but on everyone else's faces as well, including his own team who had been just as invested in the story as Team 7 even though they had remained silent. Evidently, they had been expecting something more exciting. It was Naruto who voiced what everyone was thinking, however. Wait, that's it. Guy's challenges are nothing you can just shrug off, Naruto, Kakashi said, his voice a tired drawl. Once he finds you, he won't let you go until he's completely satisfied, and that can take hours. Can't you just lose on purpose or something? Kakashi chuckled, but there was no joy to be found in it. If I lose too easily or too often, he will only get even more motivated because he wants to rekindle my spirit. There's just no escape from him. There was an awkward silence as the 6 genin looked at each other, unsure of how to react to that. Well, at least they have all but forgotten about their fight by now. Itaka was sure that at least part of Kakashi's act was to achieve just that, although he probably really felt depressed about having to deal with Guy's antics all the time. Not that Itaka felt much pity for him, mind you. For all his very vocal complaints, he had never made any serious attempt to stop Guy from bothering him for good to the best of Itaka's knowledge. At the end of the day, he likely valued their friendship, and yes, their rivalry as well, just as much as Guy did, whether he wanted to admit it or not. That much was clear to everyone who had anything to do with either man. Anyway, we really should move away from here. Itaka waited a few seconds to see if Kakashi would continue to insist on his little act, and when he didn't, he continued, "This place is far too open to serve as a place to rest and regroup. Do you have anything specific in mind?" He did, actually, although he didn't really like it. There was a place that was perfectly suited to serve their purposes for a while, but he would in all honesty prefer not to go there as it brought up rather uncomfortable memories. However, in their current situation, he couldn't allow his feelings to affect his actions, so he pushed them aside. "I do," he said, careful not to let any of his thoughts show in his voice. Then he turned to Sasuke, who unconsciously straightened up the second his gaze fell on him. "Let's see if you paid attention during your history lessons, shall we? What place is nearby that might be suitable for our accommodation?" His brother blinked in surprise, but then his brows furrowed in concentration. It didn't take him long to realize Itaka wasn't talking about his history lessons at the academy but the ones all children of their clan went through, and even less time to conclude what place he had in mind. So did Kakashi, for that matter. "That might be a good idea, actually," the other Jonin said after Sasuke had shared his idea. "We should be able to make it there before nightfall, too." Decision made, and ignoring the bewildered faces of most of the genin, they set off their way. The Uchiha hideout was as impressive as ever. Built into a terraced mountain with vast forestry growing on each level and 2 towers, one on each side of it, connecting to the main building with bridges, it was truly awe-inspiring, especially to those who had never seen it before. The faces of the 6 genin were certainly sufficiently amazed. Even Kakashi, who must have been here before, actually had his book closed for once in favor of letting his eyes roam around to enjoy the view. Itaka, on the other hand, felt more somber and even depressed rather than awed. A bit weirded out, too. That was only understandable, of course. No one would be entirely comfortable visiting the place they had died. Although to be fair, it wasn't as if many people actually had the opportunity to do so in the first place, the Edo Tensei notwithstanding. And as if his own death wasn't already enough baggage, the memories of his fight with Sasuke were only made worse by the presence of his brother's younger counterpart of this timeline. Speaking of his brother, I wasn't aware that any of the clans still had such big outposts outside the village. Sasuke nodded proudly at Shino's words, eager to use this opportunity to show off his knowledge. Although it's still called the Uchiha hideout, it technically isn't our property anymore. Its ownership had been transferred to the village shortly after Konoha was founded to serve as a military outpost. I think the leadership of any group stationed here has traditionally always been given to an Uchiha as a sign of respect, though. I didn't even know that Konoha had any big outposts like this, Naruto muttered, probably not even intending for anyone to hear him. Unfortunately, however, everyone did. "That's because you were always asleep during history class," Sakura said with an unimpressed look on her face before suddenly averting her eyes while her cheeks turned pink. Although I didn't know about this one either. Somewhat to Itaka's surprise, Sasuke didn't get annoyed when he replied, and neither did he sound haughty or try to hold the information over their heads. "They didn't mention it in class. We only talked about specific battles if they had some major impact of some sort, I think, and there hadn't been any of those here, so there really wasn't any reason to talk about the hideout." "It would have been cool to hear about it anyway," Kiba said absently, letting his gaze wander all over the place as their group finally passed through one of the 4 main entrances to the fortress. "It's pretty badass. I wish my family had something like this." "It is rather impressive," Shino agreed. The Abarame clan lived hidden deeply in the most impenetrable parts of the forests and mostly kept to themselves prior to joining Konoha, so we never built anything like this. Hey, what am I supposed to say? The Inyazuka barely even existed before the founding of Konoha. Then, both simultaneously turned to look at Hinata as if to ask, what about you? Evidently not expecting that, she briefly tensed in surprise and took a moment to reply. My family actually still has some properties outside the village. No fortresses or anything like this, though. Only some smaller plots of land and some old lodgings. That was not very surprising in Itaka's opinion. While the Hyuga were feared fighters on the battlefields even during the Warring States period, they actually didn't participate as actively as most other clans. Instead, they made themselves at home at the courts of powerful nobles and daimyos, even marrying into their families with some regularity. Unless their hosts' interests were truly at high risk, they rarely took to the battlefield. Out of the corner of his eye, Itaka noticed that Naruto looked somewhat downtrodden, and it didn't take for him to realize that he had probably learned about the fate of the Uzumaki clan at some point. However, before he could open his mouth to change the topic, Sakura beat him to it. But Sasuke, if this is a military outpost, why is nobody here? Shouldn't there be at least some troops stationed here at all times? This remark distracted Naruto just as successfully as it caused Sasuke to stumble. Well, that is because, Taking pity on him, Itaka decided to help him out. While this is indeed an important outpost, possibly even the most important one in the Land of Fire, it also is an important heritage site for the Uchiha clan. For this reason, it was decided not to station anyone here unless military or political circumstances make this a necessity. Naturally, since bandits or outlaws cannot be allowed to use this place for their own benefit, troops are stationed in the area to regularly check whether everything is in order. Itaka was aware that Kakashi had contacted these exact troops a little bit prior while their students had been distracted, by the way. He didn't know for sure what his message had included, of course, but if he had to take a guess, he would assume he wanted them to not intervene in whatever those bandits that attacked them were up to. Probably for the same reason that Itaka had only observed his own students' fights against those missing nins, too. The most important one, Sensei. Hinata asked from his right, asking the question that was plain to see on the faces of all the genin. Itaka nodded but didn't immediately reply. Instead, he first looked at his brother to see if he could and wanted to answer that question only for him to avoid his eyes and flush beet red. Taking that as his cue, he then continued, it's hard if not outright impossible to say whether this is really the most important outpost or not, of course, he admitted with a wry smile. After all, there are several fortresses and hideouts all over the country, and it's not easy to rank one above all the others. However, there is no doubt that the Uchiha hideout is one of the few fortifications that can actually compete for that spot. And why is that? Why don't you tell me? The unimpressed looks on all three of his students were priceless, and amusingly enough, even Sasuke and Naruto, who had had the pleasure of being trained by him in the past, quickly followed suit. If you look at its position on the map, what do you notice? There was a short pause as all genin thought about it for a few moments. Then, Hinata spoke up. It's located not too far from the Kabasawa mines, isn't it? So it can protect Konoha's iron supply. Itaka nodded. That's one reason, yes. It also lies directly between our border with the Land of Rivers and the capital where the daimyo lives, Shino added with a thoughtful frown. Consequently, it can serve as a line of defense against any potential invasion from the west. That is correct, too. Next, as if to not be outdone, Sasuke added, there's a river close by that surrounds the fortress from three sides. The only side open is the one facing inland. In addition to the already existing fortifications, that makes conquering this hideout all that much harder. It can probably also serve as a headquarter during wars, right? Sakura asked. I think managing everything from Konoha would be pretty hard. It would be much easier to do so from somewhere closer to the front. That are both very good points, Itaka said with a smile. As all of you already summarized, its location is what gives it its importance. From here, it's not only in a prime position to protect both the nearby mines and the capital but can also serve as a headquarter to manage any potential western front. It's close enough to the border to receive quick updates which allow whoever is in charge to react in a timely manner while still being far enough away to avoid immediately coming under attack itself if the enemy manages to make a push. Furthermore, while the distance is a bit on the longer side, it's still close enough to Konoha to keep up an active communication with the village and the leadership there. The reason no major battle has ever taken place here has to do with its location as well. If an enemy wants to make any gains beyond this point, they have to take this fortress. Quite a lot of shinobi can be accommodated here, after all, and no commander wants to have such a large number of enemies behind their own lines. However, by the time they have finally advanced so far that they have reached this fortress, the lines would already be quite stretched, making it hard to gather a suitably powerful army to actually attack. After all, it's just as Sasuke said, the nearby rivers make attacking even harder, and the fortifications and elevated position do the rest. Therefore, no enemy army has ever even attempted to attack here, judging that it's just not worth the cost. Technically, fortresses were not all that effective against shinobi armies. While the number of people who could create attacks powerful enough to destroy them by themselves was small, it wasn't too difficult to have many people work together for a common goal. A dozen or so powerful earth techniques hitting it at the same time would probably be enough to bring the Uchiha hideout down, for example. However, as Konoha had several clans with enhanced senses like the Hyuga at its disposal, sneaking close enough to actually do so was all but impossible, and the elevated position allowed the defenders to attack enemies long before they could get in range to attack themselves. Add to that the large number of defenders who could use the environment to their advantage, and one could see why the Uchiha hideout was the exception to the rule. It was this powerful defense that was responsible for avoiding defeat against Tsunagakuer in any of the previous wars. At the very least, they had always been able to force a draw with them, no matter how desperate the situation on the other fronts might be. That was particularly true after the First Shinobi World War, which was also the only time Suna actually managed to force that aforementioned draw. At the time when the villages were first founded, the world map looked a bit different than it did today. One good example was the Land of Wind. Large parts of what was today the Land of Rivers had initially been part of it, and quite important ones too, as it was there that much of the nation's agriculture happened. However, after they became one of the losing parties of the war, it had been decided to give much of their lands to the then still much smaller Land of Rivers to serve as a buffer between the two great nations. That had a lasting impact on both the nation's population and economics. Such redistributions of land weren't usually done after shinobi wars, especially not with such large areas at once. After all, while it was the shinobi villages that fought each other, the land itself ultimately belonged to the daimyos. There were always consequences for them as well when their hidden villages were the ones who lost, yes, but never to the point where they literally lost their nation's most fertile areas. However, that particular case was one of the very few times where the hidden villages abandoned all subtlety and actually forced a daimyo to accept their demands. Now that Itachi thought about it, that event might even be the starting point of the tense relationship Suna traditionally had with its daimyo, the royal family never quite forgiving the village for losing their lands due to its supposed incompetence. Oh, wow. What is this? Part of Itachi had hoped that they would not pass the large meeting hall, or if they did, that none of the children would be curious about it. In hindsight, that had been far too naive. He could have subtly led the way to avoid this particular corridor, of course, but in the end, he couldn't actually bring himself to do so. Maybe I actually want to revisit this place myself, he thought wryly. The one that had spoken a few moments earlier was Naruto, who had been walking ahead of their group, and his exclamation quickly resulted in the remaining children rushing ahead to see what got him so excited, forgetting all about the two adults at the back. They are rather excited, aren't they? Itachi nodded in agreement. They never left the village for any significant amount of time before. It makes sense for them to become so agitated when visiting a place as impressive as this. Meh, Kakashi shrugged. It could do with a thorough cleaning if you ask me. It was obvious that he was acting obnoxious on purpose, so Itachi didn't bother to reply to that. Besides, he could feel that the other man had something else he wanted to talk about anyway. He was proven right a few seconds later. Being a teacher suits you. It has been surprisingly rewarding so far. It was hard to believe that he had actually been hesitant about accepting a team at first. While it didn't exactly help him get stronger in the traditional sense, it did help him see things from a different perspective. It seems to be true what they say about going back to the roots being helpful to improve. Entertaining, too. Kakashi chuckled at that. That, I can agree with. Did Sasuke tell you about my bell test? He did. Even if he ignored the undoubtedly embellished parts of the story, it seems like Team 7 put on a pretty impressive show. Unfortunately, that didn't prevent them from landing in some rather embarrassing situations, and while Sasuke had omitted what had happened to him, Naruto had made sure to tell him every yet so little detail shortly after. I hear a lot about your training from him. I have to say, I'm impressed that the only thing he has complained to me about so far is your frequent tardiness. I would like to think that there is a lot more about my training methods that the three of them are not too happy about. Sasuke may be a lot of things, but he's not one to hand out unwarranted praise. If he can't find anything to complain about, it's because there is nothing to find to begin with. Then I guess I must be doing at least something right, huh? That was actually a very interesting point. It was no secret that Kakashi had failed all his previous genin, so Itachi seriously wondered what made him truly accept his brother's team. After all, while many weren't aware of it, Jonin could hand their teams over to someone else if they thought they were unsuitable to teach them. Had any other team before Team 7 passed his test, Itachi wouldn't have been surprised if Kakashi had done just that, too. However, in this timeline and the previous one both, he not only kept them but wholeheartedly accepted them as well. Itachi had a few suspicions as to why that was, of course, but there was no way to prove any of them without outright asking the man. Maybe one day. The same goes to you, by the way, Kakashi continued after a short pause. The way your brats look at you and the way you handled that conversation earlier, you look like you know what you're doing. Enough so for you to let me handle your students too, you mean? Well, Kakashi said with a one-eyed smile, part of being a teacher means knowing when to do something myself and when to stand back and watch. Besides, you looked like you had fun and I really didn't want to get in the way of that. Itachi briefly considered replying with a similarly dry reply, but before he had the chance to do so, they reached the entrance to the meeting hall and the moment was over. The Uchiha crest prominently framed the doorway on both sides. At the front of the hall, elevated above the rest of the room by a platform, sat a throne with the Uchiha crest on either side of it and two tomo-like shapes below those as well. Directly behind the seat was a poster that showed the symbol for fox surrounded by 8 swirls. The design of the throne itself allowed the poster to be clearly visible behind it to anyone who entered the hall. Overall, it was just as he remembered it before Sasuke's techniques first destroyed much of the room and later the entire building during their fight. Whether that was a good thing was anyone's guess, though. Anyway, he had other things to worry about at the moment. Would you please refrain from doing that, Naruto? The boy froze in mid-motion, hand outstretched and with an expression on his face as if he had been caught red-handed with his hand in the cookie jar where he stood just one step away from the throne. That didn't last for long, though. But why? I want to see what the view is like from there. It has been traditionally prohibited to sit on the throne for centuries now, he said. While I cannot stop you from sitting on it when I'm not with you, I would still like to ask you not to do so. It wasn't as if he had any illusions about whether other people adhered to this taboo. With how many people had been stationed here over the years, it was inevitable that a good number of them had wanted to sit on the throne just as Naruto did right now. The only thing he could say with reasonable certainty was that no Uchiha had ever done so since it became prohibited. No Uchiha other than him, that is. He had deliberately sat on it during his fight with Sasuke as an additional snub, although he hadn't been completely sure if his brother would even realize that at the time. Itachi-sensei. Sakura shyly spoke up. Why is it forbidden to sit there? I mean, it looks like a throne, but in the end, it's just a seat, right? For the most part, this taboo serves as a reminder never to push too far. To be content with what we have rather than try to elevate our status. Not that the Uchiha clan ever really stopped reaching for more, mind you, but at least the attempt had been made. It's from a time when our ancestors were still considered nobility and even royalty. What? The reaction of all 6 of them was as expected as it was entertaining. What do you mean, royalty? Sasuke exclaimed. Why is this the first time I hear of that? Itachi chuckled a bit. That's not surprising. Neither the lessons of our clan nor those of the academy go into much detail about anything prior to the meeting between Madara Uchiha and Hashirama Senju. I suspect the same is true for the Hyuga as well. He turned towards Hinata when he said that last part, well aware that hers was the only other clan of their group ancient enough to even entertain the idea of having records that old. Then, once she confirmed his suspicion, he continued, it's understandable, of course, as there is only so much time that can be spent on something that ultimately has little bearing on us today. It makes more sense to focus on more recent events, or at least on things that continue to affect our lives to this very day. But Nii-san, Sasuke said, not even noticing that he had slipped up in how he called him, then how do you know about all of this? History can be quite interesting, he replied good-naturedly. Furthermore, we're bound to repeat our mistakes if we forget the past, so it's never wrong to read up on history when you have some free time. There's much we can learn from the tales of our ancestors, you know. Can you tell us? That question was hardly unexpected. Itachi had known where all this would lead to and had, in fact, played along from the very beginning. Judging from the amusement Kakashi had been radiating for some time now, he too had realized that this would happen. Reflecting on their previous conversation, he probably felt that his earlier words about how being a teacher suited him were being confirmed. Itachi ignored him, of course. Barely a minute after he had given his consent, he somehow found himself sitting on the uppermost step that led up to the elevated platform where the throne stood with the 6 genin sitting in a semicircle in front of him. Kakashi stood a bit more aside, leaning against the nearby wall. However, while his eyes refocused on the newly opened book in his hand, the fact that he had stayed within earshot in his eyes did not wander from one end of the page to the other showed that he was just as curious about what Itachi had to say as their students. Well, for starters, you might not be aware of it, but what we call the Warring States period refers only to the time of about 3 centuries before the founding of the hidden villages. There is no uniform name for the time before that, and we don't know enough about it or any other, even earlier time periods to even begin to think about naming them. But the time before the Warring States period was somewhat of a middle ground between it and today's shinobi organizational system of the 5 great nations. Shinobi clans lived in their own small settlements, but instead of confining themselves to their own small pieces of land and offering their services to the highest bidder, many of them actively sought to rule over others themselves. Daimyos and their samurai armies also already existed, but they were far less influential and powerful than they would become during the Warring States period. The map of that time looked nothing like it does today. Some familiar nations like the Land of Fire already existed even back then, of course, but they were much smaller and insignificant, being only one of many small nations that existed at that point. In hindsight, it might have been this very irrelevance that allowed the Land of Fire to survive to this day as other, more powerful nations ignored it in favor of more worthwhile targets. It was then that the Uchiha, like many other shinobi clans at the time, conquered territories and called themselves rulers. But then why did they stop? Kiba interrupted him, his face scrunched up in confusion. I mean, if I called myself king or something, I wouldn't just decide to stop one day, right? Nobody is quite sure what brought that era to a close. Some records indicate that the collapse of several powerful nations within a short span of time led to great unrest, which eventually resulted in the chaos of the Warring States period. Others mention a roaming horde that traveled all over the continent and destroyed everything in their path as cause for it, and yet again others believe that the various shinobi nations weakened each other to the point where the daimyos with their samurai armies could usurp power away from them. In all likelihood, it's a combination of all 3 theories and more. But that's stupid. How could a bunch of wandering people beat so many shinobi? And samurai are weaker than us, too, aren't they? It's not stupid, Shino replied to Kiba's exclamation. Why? Because if sufficiently outnumbered, shinobi will lose to samurai regardless of what advantage we might have. Furthermore, those traveling hordes might very well have been shinobi who were driven from their homelands and joined together to survive. If so, they would have been a serious threat to any weakened nation. I can't believe our ancestors would have given up just like that, though, Sasuke said musingly. Even if we lost some battles, the Uchiha don't just give up what we see as ours, so I don't see why we could stop calling ourselves kings and emperors no matter what. Naruto snorted. What, are you disappointed? I can call you Your Highness if you want. That's not what I mean. I'm just saying that it's weird, that's all. Well, your clan still exists and doesn't call themselves that anymore, meaning they obviously did give up, so I don't see why you're so bothered about it. Itaka cleared his throat, making them both immediately shut up and look at him. His voice was mild when he continued. Sasuke isn't wrong. It is uncharacteristic for our clan to give up. Usually, our family has the tendency to insist on something even if doing so is ultimately harmful to us. Sasuke opened his mouth and turned back to Naruto, a smug smirk on his lips, but Itaka continued before he had the chance to open his mouth and start another fight. However, Naruto has a point as well. Regardless of what our feelings on that matter might be, it is an undeniable fact that we did, in fact, give up on our titles and much of our lands. Itaka-sensei? Sakura asked, shyly raising her hand. We learned at the academy that the Uchiha and Senju clans were the most powerful clans during the Warring States period and that a client would usually contract one of them if his adversary had contracted the other. Were the two rivals even then? It's impossible to say for sure, but while it's possible that they did occasionally clash with each other, their respective territories were too far apart for there to realistically be many active conflicts between them. After all, you have to remember that conflicts at that time were mostly for geographic gain, so nations that didn't share a border with one another usually didn't have any reason to be antagonistic towards one another. Next, it was Hinata who spoke up. This fortress was built during that period then, wasn't it, Sensei? So this was initially the territory of the Uchiha clan. That is correct, he confirmed with a nod. This fortress lies in the heart of what was once the Uchiha clan's ancestral homeland, and it was likely built as a symbol of power to intimidate our neighbors. Although you will find many ruins and remains of powerful cathedrals and strongholds even more impressive than this one at many places all over the continent, particularly in the lands of earth and lightning, the land of fire has a distinct lack of great structures like this one. His lips briefly tucked upwards. Ironically, however, the construction had been finished less than a decade before chaos broke out and the Warring States period began, so rather than a show of force, one could instead consider it one last hurrah of a doomed nation. It was a rather interesting thought experiment to consider what would have happened if they had finished construction much earlier. After all, while large shinobi armies wouldn't have much trouble razing the fortress to the ground unless its defenders stopped them in time, armies during that long past age were much smaller. As long as the Uchiha left a sufficiently large garrison behind, they would never have had to fear having their homes destroyed and could instead attack their neighbors without restraint. The intimidating building would probably have an effect on every observer, too, discouraging possible attackers. Itaka didn't think it would have prevented the nation's ultimate downfall, and it would obviously not have been enough for them to conquer the continent, but it was an interesting thing to think about nonetheless. So I suppose the reason nobody can sit on that throne is that only these past rulers were allowed to? Sakura asked. Exactly, he said. Only those who rule absolute over both the Uchiha and their ancestral lands are allowed to do so. Sitting on it would be the same as announcing that one had the intention of doing just that, and I don't think I have to explain why that would be problematic. As far as he knew, not even Madara had ever sat on that throne. At least not when he had still been officially part of their clan or the village. Whether that was because he truly respected that taboo or just didn't want to cause unnecessary strife was anyone's guess, but the result was ultimately the same. Similarly, he wasn't quite sure what that said about himself considering he had sat on it, even if only to deceive his brother. Not that it really mattered. In that other timeline, the throne along with the entire fortress had been destroyed, and in this timeline, that event had never happened. Even if it did, the worst that would have happened was that he would be reprimanded by his parents. He was no missing nin but a respected member of society, after all. No one would seriously think he had any malicious intentions. Still, even with all that in mind, Itaka couldn't help but think that he should never sit on the throne again, not even in jest. In fact, he felt as if sitting on any throne, real or metaphorical, would only end in tragedy. It was nothing more than a gut feeling, but he had long since learned to trust his instincts. In the end, there was simply no good reason for tempting fate. Chapter 67, The Hideout 2. Let's start this from the beginning. The hideout. 2. As I know that the three of you are already familiar with each other, there won't be any need for introductions. However, as we have seen earlier today, just knowing each other doesn't mean you can also fight side by side without getting into each other's way, so that's what we're going to train now. Shino nodded at his sensei's words while suppressing the until then almost forgotten tingle of annoyance at the back of his head at the reminder of how he had almost been hit by several of Team 7's attacks during the fight. Looking back at it objectively, he and his own teammates had caused just as many problems for the three as they had for them, so it was only fair to overlook these past mistakes. Judging by the lack of reaction from the two boys at his side, they seemed to agree with that sentiment as well. Or maybe they just didn't care. Kiba in particular was both quick to anger and quick to forgive, after all, so that wasn't too surprising. Sasuke, on the other hand, well, maybe it's because he doesn't want to make a bad impression in front of his brother? That could explain it, no matter how weird Shino still thought it was to think about the fact that his sensei and his friend were actually so closely related. They just had completely different vibes from each other. Kakashi and I agree that it makes sense to hold more joint training sessions in the future, Itaka-sensei continued from where he stood in front of them, arms crossed before his chest. After all, you won't always fight side by side with people you're familiar with. You will have to be capable of fighting seamlessly even with someone you have never met before if need be. So that's why you split us up like this, then? Sasuke asked with a vague gesture at Shino and Kiba. To learn how to fight with people we don't usually fight with. Exactly. We will rotate the groups eventually as well, but we decided it would be beneficial to start this training by putting you together with someone you're the most familiar with already. While Shino was willing to believe that this was one of the reasons the two groups were put together the way they were, he wagered that a lot more thought had gone into the specific pairings than that. Shino, Kiba, and Sasuke were friends, yes, but none of them was really close. When they were out with friends, Shino usually stuck closer to Shikamaru, who, despite his laziness, had a much more approachable temperament than the rest of their more chaotic friends, and by extension Koji. Kiba, on the other hand, had probably been the closest with Naruto before landing on a team with Shino and only got along with Sasuke because he and Naruto were always together. If the two Jonin really wanted to create a group with people already familiar with each other, they would have put Kiba and Naruto into the same group. With Itaka-sensei being Sasuke's brother, there was no way he didn't know enough about their dynamic to realize that as well. No, Shino felt that the main reason the two groups were the way they were was because of the composition of the other group. Hinata had never been very outgoing. She worked just fine with whoever she was teamed up with during group assignments and could hold conversations with everyone, but it was no secret that she had had no real friends at the academy. She probably interacted generally more with other girls than boys, though, so putting her in a group with Sakura made sense. Similarly, Shino had to admit that for all that Naruto could be seriously annoying at times, he had a way of getting along with everyone around him, so having him there as well was also a logical choice, too. Or maybe Shino was just overthinking things and the groups had been created on little more than a whim. He definitely had a tendency to do so from time to time. All right. Kiba exclaimed from Shino's left while excitedly palming his fist, quickly joined by a bark from Akamaru, who was sitting on his head. Let's do this. Then, after a short pause, he added with a somewhat awkward smile, what exactly is it that we will be doing? Shino noticed Sasuke rolling his eyes and opening his mouth, probably to make some sort of sarcastic comment, to his right, but Itaka-sensei beat him to it. Simple, he said with the kind of smile Shino had learned was a sign that the following training session would be particularly exhausting. You three will fight me to the best of your ability. That doesn't sound too bad, Shino thought with a mixture of relief and mistrust. Maybe. And at the end of the day, we will compare how well you have done compared to the other group. Whoever did worse will then do some additional exercises as encouragement to do better next time. Ah, there it is. Shino had absolutely no interest in doing any more training after this session was over, and judging from Sasuke's and Kiba's expressions, neither did they. The difference between these two and him, however, was that they were immediately all fired up while he would have preferred to first fall back and come up with a plan before acting. Plan Maki Buse. Kiba exclaimed at the same time Sasuke called, Plan Okawa, before simultaneously rushing at Itaka-sensei, and neither seemed to register that each other had not only had no idea what they were talking about but not even listened to them in the first place. And maybe Shino should have tried to stop them, but all he could do was let out a tired, and more importantly, exasperate, sigh. I better prepare myself for those additional exercises, I suppose. You know, I can't put my finger on it, but you somehow seem more, well, confident, I suppose, than you did back at the academy. Hinata gave the other girl a surprised look at these words. Really? Yes, Sakura chuckled, gently bumping their shoulders together. I'm really not sure what it is, but that's the feeling I'm getting when I look at you. Yeah, totally. Naruto exclaimed from the other end of the room they were in before heading towards where she and Sakura were sitting with their backs against the wall. And it's not just you. Shino and Kiba are the same as well, you know. For a few seconds, all she could do was blink in surprise. However, she quickly caught herself and gave both Sakura and Naruto a thoughtful look, searching for anything she might have missed before. Then, I think I know what you mean, she said slowly, her head unconsciously tilted to the side. You two are the same. Naruto beamed at her. You really think so? Sweet. Well, Sakura added from her left with a small, proud smile, we did train a lot, so it's only fair that we're better than we were at the academy, don't you think? Hinata nodded, but she was only listening with one ear. It really was hard to point out what exactly it was that was different from before, but if she had to take a guess, it was probably the way they carried themselves. Naruto, for all his bluster and endless energy, had always seemed somewhat lackluster to her eyes. Maybe it was her upbringing, but the way he, and most of their classmates as well, for that matter, had regularly put their heads on their arms and had laid sprawled on their desks during class had always rubbed her the wrong way. Unless he had been about to spar or was playing with his friends, he had been the same on the schoolyard as well, standing slumped over and half asleep with a bored look on his face. Now he actually stood with a straight spine and attentive expression, though. He was clearly still full of energy, judging by the way he paced through the room instead of joining her and Sakura, but he was also paying attention to his surroundings instead of just mindlessly wandering around, which was definitely a great improvement. Sakura, on the other hand, had always been a model student. With her, finding what had changed was much harder, but Hinata thought it was the look in her eyes. Before, being good at the various subjects had likely been a matter of pride only because she could brag to her friends and family about it. Similarly to most civilians, she hadn't really understood the severity of the life of a kunoichi. Her classes at the hospital had probably opened her eyes somewhat, but it was only now that this realization was truly reflected in them. Hinata wondered what changes they had noticed in her that had given her own growth away. It was then that Naruto brought her back into the present. But you're really lucky to have Itaki as your sensei, you know, he said, hands clasped behind his head. You wouldn't believe how grumpy Sasuke was when he didn't get to be on his team. I think I can, actually, she replied with a soft chuckle. I have a little sister, too. If I were to become a sensei to one of her classmates instead of her, well, she shrugged a little helplessly. I don't think she would be so quick to forgive me, never mind that it wouldn't be up to me to choose my team in the first place. The image of a pouting Hanabi brought a smile to her lips without her even noticing. Oh, right. Sakura said. I forgot you had a sister as well. To be completely honest, Hinata had no idea why she even knew that at all. Had she mentioned that at some point during the academy and just forgotten about it? How old is she? She turned 8 just a bit after we graduated. Wow, so that means she's 5 years younger than you, right? Asked Naruto. That's the same age difference as between Itaki and Sasuke. Who knows, maybe you really can become your sister's sensei. Hinata took a moment to remind herself once again that her sensei was actually only 17 himself before she shook her head and turned her attention back to the conversation. I don't think it's very common for people to become jonin at such a young age, Naruto-kun, much less a jonin instructor. He dismissed her reasonable argument without a second's hesitation. Not with that attitude you won't. I, however, most definitely will. You want to become a sensei? Sakura asked, and judging by the incredulous look she gave him, she appeared to very much doubt that. He visibly withered under her gaze. Well, Not really, but maybe someday. Sakura kept her eyes on him for a few more seconds before heaving an exasperated sigh and looking away. They do have a nice dynamic, Hinata thought to herself. It seems that without Sasuke being around to distract him or start a fight with, Naruto can actually hold a normal conversation. There was something more important to think about at the moment, though. She cleared her throat to get both their attention. Do you know when Kakashi-sensei will be here? We have been waiting for a while now while the others have already started training. She had actually checked on them only a few minutes ago with her Byakugan, so she knew that for a fact. Furthermore, she also knew that Team 7's sensei had been nowhere to be found, too, which was somewhat suspicious. She didn't expect the response she got. Meh, don't expect him for another hour or so, Naruto said dismissively before going back to pacing the room. Maybe 2, just to be sure. She blinked. But he is never on time, Sakura explained with another sigh before Hinata could even voice her question. You get used to it. It's the only way not to go crazy while you're waiting for him. That seemed like a terrible attitude to have, Hinata thought. Especially when one was supposed to set an example to their students. She tried to imagine her own sensei doing the same, but the very idea of him being late was so strange that she gave up after just a few seconds. So he's really always late? Oh, no, not always, Naruto replied with a chuckle that, to her surprise, held no hint of humor. About 2 weeks after we became his students, we realized that he's always at least 90 minutes late no matter what time we agreed to meet, so we decided that we might as well be late too. I didn't really like the idea, to be honest, but some additional time to sleep in the morning sounded nice, so I agreed, Sakura continued. We were set to start training the next day at 6 in the morning, so we all agreed to meet at a little after 7. That meant we would get 1 more hour to sleep while still being early enough to be there before him. However, Naruto took over again, his voice getting louder to sound more dramatic. He was already waiting for us when we arrived. The one time we're late was also the day he decided to be on time for once. Sakura gave a mirthless chuckle. Needless to say, we were running laps all day. That, actually sounded rather funny. Only because it hadn't happened to her, of course, and she would never admit it to their faces lest they got cross with her, but still. It also sounded as if Kakashi-sensei had been baiting them on purpose just to see how they would react, which in turn would mean he had always, or at least most of the time, been around to watch them without them knowing. If that's the case, then Hinata was just about to activate her Byakugan to check her theory when a plume of white smoke appeared in front of them with a puff. Oh my, here I am, trying to give you guys some time to bond, and all I get in return is having my good name slandered? Shame on you. So he really has been watching us, huh? Considering that she was pretty sure he was going to give them some extra strenuous exercises for talking behind his back like that, regardless of whether he was actually offended or not, Hinata couldn't bring herself to be particularly proud of the fact that she had been proven right. Unfortunately, as soon as she thought that, she was proven right a second time. Well then, Kakashi-sensei continued with a far too cheerful voice. Who of you is ready for some good old-fashioned endurance training? As Itachi had explained to the 6 genin hours earlier, the Uchiha hideout was a very easy place to defend. In ancient times, long before the founding of the hidden villages, the Uchiha with their Sharingan and a handful of trained sensor types could spot pretty much every intruder long before they could become a threat, and more recently, the addition of the likes of the Hyuga, Aburame, and Inyazuka clans made this job even easier. Unless someone truly exceptional came along, there was no way to get surprised by an attack while inside the fortress. As their group's composition included most of these components and even had experience as Jonin like himself and Kakashi on it, they were really not in any danger. Even if their opponents were something more dangerous than a bunch of bandits, they would most likely be fine. There was the possibility of the people that had attacked Team 7 being just the vanguard and that there was someone more dangerous pulling the strings in the background, but according to Kakashi, who had actually investigated into their assailants' background while he was away from his team and even interrogated some of them, that wasn't the case. Itachi trusted him enough to take his word for it. Regardless, just for the off chance that he was wrong and something did go awry, there always needed to be someone keeping guard. especially when the rest of their group was sleeping. But that was standard practice on a mission anyway, so it wasn't as if that was some sort of additional burden. With this being their first night in the hideout, and with his team having just finished their own mission while the genin of Team 7 had fought bandits every day for 2 weeks now, Itaki and Kakashi decided to give them this night off and take over guard duty by themselves. Well, by themselves and their summons, that was. The hideout was quite big, after all, so 2 pairs of eyes really wasn't enough to cover it all effectively. Having Kakashi's Ninken and their noses on the ground and his own crows keeping an eye on the situation from the sky made things much easier. They would probably continue to help out in the following nights when the genin took over guard duty, too. He didn't know how long they would stay here exactly, but it would likely be several days at least. Kakashi seemed to think this place suitable for the little test he wanted to conduct, conveniently making use of the bandits they had run into, and Itaka didn't make a habit of hampering with his fellow teachers' methods. Anyway, since it was the middle of the night, the only ones who should still be awake were him and Kakashi. The rest of their group should be dead asleep in the living area deep within the building. It was, after all, not only a fortress but a place intended to serve as a retreat for the Uchiha clan should they ever need it. Therefore, it only made sense that there were areas designated for them to live in. Due to their group's small numbers, they didn't even have to sleep in one of the newer sleep chambers meant to accommodate as many shinobi as possible built after ownership of the building was transferred to Konoha, but could instead actually all sleep in separate rooms that were normally made available only to high-ranking officers. Of course, much to everyone's chagrin, Itaki had insisted that at least 2 people had to share a room for security reasons anyway. However, the real reason why he did that had nothing to do with security at all. No. He merely used this pretext as an excuse to create the right conditions to speak with 2 of his students in private without anyone else noticing. Itaki entered their room without bothering to knock, and as expected, both of them were still wide awake. I am glad to see that you remain mindful of your surroundings even now that we are in apparent safety. Shino and Kiba looked back at him from their respective resting places, the former having apparently been the one fortunate enough to score the bed for the night while the latter had put the bedroll he shared with Akamaru at the other end of the small room, and neither of them seemed surprised at his appearance. Considering Itaki hadn't done anything to hide his scent and did notice the bugs stationed in the corridor on his way here, he hardly found that surprising. You told us to always remain alert, Sensei, Shino said. Yeah, Kiba agreed with a nod. Not that we think you and Kakashi-sensei would let anyone get this far anyway, mind you, but staying alert at all times has kinda become second nature to us by now, you know. Akamaru gave a soft bark in agreement before rising to his feet and slowly waddling over to him. That's nice to hear, he said as he closed the door behind him before moving over to the sole chair in the room to sit down, absently scratching Akamaru's head but keeping his eyes on the 2 boys. A teacher is always happy to hear that his methods pay off. Much to his amusement, both of them grimaced at that. Not that he could hold it against them. Having him, with the permission of their families, of course, appear in their rooms in the middle of the night to pour cold water over them was probably not their fondest memory. Similarly, finding themselves laying on the training ground hours after sunset because they hadn't noticed he secretly put them into a genjutsu during training couldn't be nice either. These methods obviously worked, though, so it had at the very least paid off. That was the most important bit. I assume you can both guess why I am here, don't you? Judging by the expressions on their faces, they could, but it was Kiba who actually spoke it out loud. This is about our fight against Guzen, right? Itaki nodded. We already broached that topic when we discussed the mission in general, but that was only you telling me how events unfolded from your perspective. I would like to know what you think of your fight now that you had actually some time to really think about it. Neither of them seemed excited by the prospect, but he ignored that. While he wouldn't go as far as to say they had been brooding, it had been clear to everyone that their moods had been rather subdued after their fight. They were obviously unhappy with their performance. Unnecessarily so, Itaki thought, but as he remembered never being quite happy with his own accomplishments when he was their age himself, he really wasn't one to judge. Shino was the first one to find his words. In my opinion, we made a few mistakes but ultimately did as well as could be expected, he said in a calm and analytical voice. We should have avoided getting worked up about his remarks. While it wasn't to the point that we stopped thinking altogether, and even though we used his tactics to our advantage by pretending to be more affected than we actually were to catch him by surprise, it was already too much to get riled up at all. On the other hand, we managed to coordinate well with each other and develop a strategy in the heat of battle to beat him while also succeeding in our goal to protect our charges, so I would generally consider this fight as an overall success. Inwardly, Itaka smiled. As analytic and to the point as always, I see. Not that this was a bad thing, of course, but in Shino's case, that was less something he did to remain objective, although that was certainly part of it, and more something to hide his true thoughts and feelings. However, what he said wasn't wrong per se, so Itaka didn't say anything about it for the moment. Although it is a bit sad. He had recently made great strides in being more open with his feelings. Real change comes only with time, I suppose. Next, he turned towards Kiba with a questioningly raised eyebrow. Not much I can add to that, really, the boy said with what was probably meant to be nonchalance. Falling for Guzen's trap was mostly my doing, though, so you can't blame Shino for that. At these words, he threw the other boy an annoyed look which Shino returned in kind, leading Itaka to believe that might be something the two had argued about before and had yet to come to an agreement on. Then, Kiba continued, I guess it was rather idiotic to keep trying to break through his guard with the same general approach, but it's not like we had much of a choice on that matter. That was our strongest combo, after all, so if that didn't really work, nothing else in our arsenal would have either. It has to be added that it did ultimately work, however, Shino said, and although he was technically still talking to Itaka, his eyes were actually focused mostly on his teammate. It wasn't perfect, but due to Kiba and Akamaru using that new attack of theirs towards the end, it worked out. None of my attacks would have had the power to do the same, so it's only fair to say that we won thanks to them. Don't be ridiculous, Kiba scoffed while Akamaru jumped up from Itaka's lap, where he had been laying till then, and rushed to his partner. I might have broken through that stupid armor of his, but I didn't beat him, you did. And the only reason I could do anything at all was that you destroyed his armor. Yours was the most important role in our plan for this very reason. A plan you came up with. Do you think I could have done that? That's not the point. Why? Because even though I was the one who came up with it, it all depended on you. There was a short pause. Then, besides, the plan didn't really work out either. In the end, we still would have died if Sensei hadn't interfered. You dash. I think this is quite enough, Itaka interrupted the two, and judging by their surprised expressions, both of them had apparently all but forgotten about him till that point. Fighting between ourselves won't help anyone, don't you think? Let's instead break down what you have said so far. It is clear to me that both of you are unhappy with your own performance in that fight but also believe the other did well. If you ask me, however, you're both wrong. But dash. Sensei dash. He held up one hand to make them both fall silent. I say you're both wrong because neither of you has been solely responsible for carrying that fight. As admirable as it is that you try to make each other take the credit, it's important not to undervalue yourself and to remember that this was a team effort above all else. You, he pointed at Shino, came up with the plan and seized the opportunity Kiba provided you with while you, he pointed at the other boy, not only realized that Shino would be more suitably for coming up with a strategy but also unconditionally trusted him when he did and then lived up to your words by actually breaking through Guzen's armor. As far as I'm concerned, both of you did very well in that fight. Much better than a pair of green genin could reasonably have expected to, in fact. That were Itaka's true thoughts on this matter. The main reason he had arranged for them to fight Guzen was that his previous observations of the man had convinced him that his abilities were enough to give them a good challenge, strong, but not too strong. Had he known that he actually possessed crystal release, well, he might have thought twice about letting them fight him. The only reason he didn't immediately interfere when that little secret was exposed was that he had been confident he could do so at any point without endangering his students' lives and because he wanted to see how they would fare against him. That's nice and all, but it doesn't mean much if I fall unconscious every time I use that technique. You still had to save us in the end, though. Kiba and Shino blinked in surprise when they spoke up at the same time, and while Itaka found the sight rather amusing, he suppressed his smile lest they got the wrong idea and thought he was making fun of them. Instead, he turned towards Kiba first. There are many techniques that come with a variety of side effects. I'm admittedly not an expert in regards to Inyazuka techniques specifically, but I did talk with Hana and your mother after accepting you as my student, so I know that you will eventually be able to use that technique of yours for much longer and without falling unconscious after every use. Until then, you just have to determine whether it is worth using or not. He paused for a bit, considering how much he should share exactly, before continuing, my own trump cards come with much worse side effects, too, if that makes you feel any better. Immediately after speaking these words, Itaka could feel renewed interest from both boys as their eyes suddenly looked at him much more eagerly, although Shino at least tried to be subtle about it. Your trump cards, sensei. This time, he didn't bother suppressing his smile at Kiba's question. Indeed. They are my strongest techniques by far, but you can count the number of times I have used them, at least in this timeline, on one hand and still having fingers left at the end. Really? Shino asked, his voice only barely more controlled than his teammates. Are the repercussions that bad? I would say so, yes. You see, aside from consuming a lot of chakra, to the point where only using them only 2 or 3 times would already totally exhaust me, repeated usage will ultimately result in blindness. He could tell that they hadn't expected that. Their shock was understandable, though. It was no secret that blindness was one of, if not the worst thing that could happen to a dojutsu user. Potentially even more so than even death. Well, at least they're no longer so gloomy. Kiba, he said, intent on bringing the conversation back on track, I understand that you're disappointed, but you will only get better from here. Continue to train hard and you will have that technique, as well as many others, down in no time. The only thing the boy could do in response was to nod. I think you need to hear the same thing, Shino, Itaka said next as he turned to his other student. I know that me arriving at the end to save you bothers you, but you have to realize that getting as far as you two did against a superior opponent like Guzan was very impressive. He realized that he might have chosen his words poorly the moment they left his mouth, but there was no taking them back now. While what he had said was nothing but the truth, being so blunt about Guzan being stronger than them was the last thing Shino needed to hear right now, and the way his shoulders sagged at his words proved him right. Yes, being able to handle the truth even if it was uncomfortable was important, but at the end of the day, shinobi were still humans. There were times, especially with young Genin, when a softer approach was more appropriate. He had every advantage over you in terms of physical strength, experience, and his arsenal of techniques, but you still forced him to his absolute limit and even almost beat him, he continued without letting his thoughts show in his voice, trying to emphasize on their accomplishments in order to mitigate some of the harm of his previous statement. As you know, I have been watching the entire fight, and yet I only interfered at the very end. Why do you think is that? Because you didn't need to do so earlier. He gave him an encouraging smile. Exactly. Seeing Shino's still dissatisfied expression, he then added, I'm aware that nothing I say really matters unless you want to believe me, and I'm not going to try and force you to change your mind. If you really want to insist on your performance being unsatisfying, you may do so. However, what I can do is tell you that I, and, as we have clearly seen earlier, Kiba as well, think you have done great and that your contribution was essential in you two being as successful as you were. Kiba nodded enthusiastically from his bedroll, and that in combination with Itaka's words was enough to make Shino flush and turn away. Once again, Itaka was reminded of how fortunate he was that his team went along so well. From what he had heard from Sasuke, Shino, and Kiba might have been part of the same group of friends for years but ultimately ignored each other for the most part. They were friends, but no close friends. Since they had become his students, there had been frequently little fights between them whenever their personalities clashed, but somehow, without Itaka having to do anything about it, these fights quickly evolved into something more playful than anything else. And when they did occasionally become more serious, Hinata was always there to put a stop to it before it could escalate for real. Yes, he had really gotten lucky by getting these three as his students. Shino and Kiba trying to shoulder all blame by themselves while supporting each other was proof enough of that. For a short while, no one said a word. Then, however, Kiba apparently decided that this had gone on long enough and that he needed to lighten the mood. So, sensei, he said teasingly with a shit-eating grin on his face, You said earlier that you talked to my sister about our clan's techniques, right? Is there anything else you talked about that you want to tell me? For some reason Itaka didn't quite understand, even Shino seemed oddly interested in his reaction. Well, if they can already joke around like this again, I suppose they must be feeling better now. Chapter 68, The Hideout 3. Let's start this from the beginning. The Hideout 3. Hinata suppressed a yawn as she slowly walked through the dark corridors of the Uchiha hideout, absently rubbing her arms. She liked her sleeveless blouse, of course, just as she liked pretty much every present Hanabi ever got her, but she had to admit that something warmer would have been more appropriate at the moment. It rarely ever got cold in the Land of Fire, with the temperatures not even falling below freezing in most winters, but in the middle of the night and deep within the hideout where the sun never shone, it wasn't exactly warm either. I really should have put on something warmer. Frustratingly enough, it wasn't as if she hadn't brought anything suitable with her. Clothes weren't the most essential thing to bring with you on a mission unless it brought you to a region with a drastically different climate, but everyone would prefer a change of clothes after a few days on the route, so as long as the mission didn't dictate to keep the luggage as light as possible, it was normal to bring some with you. Hinata wasn't an exception to that. Unfortunately, she didn't think about that earlier. Once she arrived at her post, she couldn't just leave, so she had no other choice but to endure it for the time being. Yesterday, the two Jonin instructors that were with them had told their two teams that they would take over guard duty as it was their first night. That offer was only valid for that one night, however. Therefore, it was up to the 6 of them to take care of it tonight. Hinata had been on the first shift together with Shino and Naruto, and her position had been located in the very heart of the hideout from where she could keep an eye. She allowed herself a small giggle at that wordplay, on everything inside the building, even if only just. Should she spot something suspicious, all she had to do was release a short burst of chakra. Shino had left a few of his Kikaicha with her and in the corridors between their two positions as well to have them form some sort of pipeline, and as soon as they felt her releasing her chakra, they would do the same. Shino would know what was going on in less than a minute even though he was at the other end of the hideout. Similarly, he could let them flare up their chakra, and Hinata, due to her Byakugan, would immediately notice that something was wrong too. Naruto was on the opposite end of the building from Shino with a bunch of his clones, and on that note, Hinata really wanted to know how he managed to learn a clone technique she was reasonably sure was restricted to Jonin or, at the very least, talented Chunin, which in turn carried some of Kikaichu as well. Should one of them get killed, they would immediately release a short burst of chakra that the rest of their kind would then relay to Shino and Hinata. All in all, she was pretty proud of what they had come up with, and while she didn't know what Kiba, Sakura, and Suzuki had up their sleeves, she liked to think it couldn't keep up with their own strategy. She had seen their competitive looks earlier that day when they heard what Hinata's team had planned, though, so she had no doubt that they had come up with something good to match them. Yes, she would certainly sleep well tonight without having to worry about any nasty surprises. However, that was something that would have to wait until later. While her shift was over, she was not currently going back to the room she shared with Sakura. She couldn't even pretend to be lost considering she could literally see the entire interior of the fortress with all its corridors and rooms if she wanted to. No, she had actually a very specific destination in mind. Sensei. He stood next to the throne on the elevated platform with his eyes presumably fixed on the poster on the wall behind it when she entered, but even though he only turned around to face her after she called him, Hinata wasn't fooled. He had definitely noticed her much earlier than that. Hinata, he greeted her with a small smile as he slowly walked down the platform. Your shift should be over by now, shouldn't it? You're not usually the type to forego sleep the night before a day of training. She almost pointed out that he himself was clearly still awake as well even though he didn't have to keep watch at all, but she managed to restrain herself just in time. I'm not, but I was hoping to talk to you for a bit. Hinata half expected him to ask her what this was all about, but all he did was raise a curious eyebrow before sitting down on the steps beneath the throne and gesturing for her to join him just like their group had done when they first arrived here and he told them about the history of the Uchiha. Even when she sat down to his right, he didn't speak up, deciding to give her some more time to collect herself and start whenever she was ready rather than make her explain herself. That was probably a good thing, too. She had been thinking about what she wanted to speak with him about for a while now, but it was hard to decide how to best bring it up, so every bit of extra time was much appreciated. But then again, if she couldn't decide on an approach even after several days of consideration, what good would a few minutes more or less really do? Maybe it was best to just be blunt and get it over with. Are you proud to be an Uchiha, sensei? She immediately regretted opening her mouth. It was bad enough to ask such a loaded question in the first place, but she also had blurted out far too quickly and mumbled. The realization that she had probably been barely comprehensible made heat rush to her cheeks. Itachi-sensei seemed unfazed, however. I admit this is not the topic I was expecting, he said with a hint of humor in his voice. Whether I'm proud to be an Uchiha, It caught Hinata off guard that he actually took some time to consider his answer. Asking someone from a clan if they were proud to be part of their family wasn't exactly a question they were supposed to think about. Even if they weren't, it was expected from them to always reply with yes, of course, or something along those lines. The only reason she had even bothered to ask him, although admittedly much more bluntly than she could have imagined even just 5 minutes ago, in the first place was that she knew he wouldn't judge her for it, and more importantly, well, if she couldn't ask him, then who else was there? Certainly no one in her family. No matter how much she loved Niji and her uncle, she wasn't stupid enough to bring up this topic around them, and Hanabi was obviously too young. Why her father wasn't an option went without saying. She supposed she could have talked with Shino and Kiba about it, but it was unlikely that they would have the answer she was ultimately looking for, so they were out as well. I am, he said after a minute or so, jolting her out of her thoughts. I don't necessarily agree with everything my clansmen say, and I strongly oppose some things the Uchiha have done in the past, but in the end, I'm still proud to wear the name and have its emblem on my back. For all their faults, they're still my family, and while that does neither absolve them from all their shortcomings nor me blind to them, it makes me at least want to give them a chance and move forward with them at my side. Her brows furrowed. Wanting to move forward with them despite their shortcomings because they're family, is it? That was pretty much the exact same answer she had arrived at herself. Unfortunately, that realization didn't solve the problem that was at the core of her current predicament. May I ask what brought this up? Hinata averted her eyes, but when she responded, her voice was steady. Do you remember what Akihito Dano said when we first arrived at his mansion? About him being a descendant of the Hyuga. He simply nodded before silently motioning for her to continue. However, there was another problem. She really couldn't continue any further. The thing that had bothered her for a while now was the realization of just what would have happened to Akihito and, maybe even more importantly, his daughter if they had actually awakened the Byakugan. Niza was just a little bit younger than Hanabi, and the thought of her either being forcefully adopted into the clan or disposed of made Hinata feel sick to the stomach. It had been relatively easy to just not think about it during their mission, to push it to the furthest corner of her mind and forget about it, but listening to her sensei speaking about his clan's past at such an imposing place brought the memories back to the forefront. The thing was that she couldn't say that out loud, though. As much as she respected and trusted her sensei, this part of her clan was very much a secret she couldn't just share on a whim. I shouldn't have brought this up in the first place, she chided herself, unconsciously clenching her fists. How stupid. There are similar cases with descendants of the Uchiha, Itachi-sensei suddenly spoke up, distracting her from her rapidly spiraling self-doubt. Not very many, and none outside the village these days, but my family doesn't have quite as strict restrictions on who to marry as the Hyuga do, so it happens with some regularity that members marry people from outside the clan. One of my close friends' family is such a case, for example. But what about the Sharinan? The question blurted out of her mouth before she even knew it. She immediately clasped her hands over her mouth, but it was too late to take it back. All she could do now was apologize for being rude, well aware of how frowned upon it was to meddle in another clan's affairs, especially if bloodlines were involved, but before she had the chance to do so, he began to chuckle. The Sharinan is a very prominent trait, he told her good-naturally. It usually awakens even if one parent isn't an Uchiha, and thankfully so. With some of the losses our numbers have taken over the years, our Kekkei Genkai likely wouldn't exist anymore if it took two Uchiha to awaken. However, children of unions between an Uchiha and a non-Uchiha are still strongly encouraged to find a partner within the clan to make sure they pass on our bloodline. For a few seconds, Hinata didn't know what to be the most surprised about, the fact that he was so openly revealing information that wasn't necessarily a clan secret but definitely something that was no common knowledge, or at the comparative freedom the Uchiha apparently had over who they could marry. Both of these things were quickly forgotten when she realized the reason why he had brought this up, though. He knew what she was getting at. While he hadn't outright said it, the implication of the Uchiha having had descendants not only outside the clan proper but the village as well right after she broached the topic meant that they must have treated these families the same way as the Hyuga. He tried to tell her that he understood what she meant and that she didn't have to disclose her clan's secrets to continue. Maybe Hinata should have felt distressed at being so transparent to his eyes, or the fact that she indirectly admitted that his suspicions about the Hyuga were indeed correct, but all she could find within herself was gratitude. Do you think that's okay? The question might sound vague, but within the context of their conversation, she was sure he would understand what she meant. Of course not. Her head spun around. Then dash. However, he interrupted her almost immediately. I can understand why they acted as they did. Then, upon noticing her shoulders slump at his words, he gave her an understanding and somewhat sad smile before continuing. There are many things that I don't approve of, things that might even be called evil, that are done out of necessity every day. At the same time, many such things are done with the claim that they are a necessary evil when they are in truth just the easiest solution, and people are too lazy or too comfortable with the current system to think about a new, better approach. While I don't think the approach of our ancestors was right, I can understand their thought process. If they didn't take care of the situation, someone else would. This wasn't a problem that they could just leave alone. Even taking into account the different mentality of their era, they could and perhaps even should have thought of a better solution than either killing or abducting them. I understand why they did what they did. That doesn't excuse their actions or all the pain they caused, of course, and it doesn't need to. What it does, on the other hand, is explain them. Make sense of them. I think this is important because we can only learn from the past if we understand it. Regardless of whether our ancestors' actions were ultimately right or wrong, it's only when we understand them that we can make sure to not repeat their mistakes and change things for the better. Unconsciously, she found herself nodding along to his words. The sentiment of not letting only her ancestors' actions shape her opinion of her clan was nice and much more positive than anything she had thought of on the subject since she had started to think about it. However, and what if their actions still have an impact even today? He gave her a knowing look. You speak about the caged bird seal, I suppose. She nodded, leaning slightly forward in anticipation of his reply without realizing that the conversation had just turned much more specific than she should be comfortable with. Unfortunately, it turned out his answer was rather disappointing. I think you already know the answer to that question, Hinata. She gasped. But I don't. Then tell me, do you think branding the members of every branch family with that seal is the right thing to do? Of course not, she exclaimed, her eyes wide. It's wrong. They don't deserve to be brand marked like that, or to be treated as they are. They're just as much members of the Hyuga clan as I am and should be respected as such. If that's the case, then why was the seal introduced in the first place? Hinata didn't even have to think about it before replying, having learned the answer to that question years ago in one of her father's history lessons and kept hearing it over and over ever since. Because one of the clan heads during the Warring States period thought of it as an effective method to stop others from stealing our Byakugan. But dash. And why did they think that? Because the Hyuga clan was weakened and greatly depleted in numbers at that time. They were constantly under attack, had lost all their noble backers, and, her voice became slower and slower the longer she continued before fading away completely at last, realizing what Itaka-sensei was trying to tell her. Or, to be more precise, what he was trying to make her realize to figure out herself. There were a lot of attacks and kidnappings at the time, and the clan was too weak to defend themselves against all of them. There were constant losses. The previous head thought the seal might be a way to make sure no one would be able to steal our eyes any longer. Maybe even discourage people from attacking because they wouldn't get anything out of it anyway. And did it work? Hinata thought about it for a second, and she really didn't like the answer she arrived at, The attacks ultimately stopped and the clan survived, so, she let out a shaky breath. I suppose it did work, yes. She didn't even notice that Itaka-sensei didn't reply. Instead, her gaze was locked on her feet as she thought about that revelation. Was the caged bird seal maybe not that bad after all? But she couldn't have been this wrong all this time, right? Hinata remembered her father telling her that the branch members who got the seal should be honored, that they were following a tradition that had existed for countless generations and that it was this seal that allowed them to be the protectors of their clan. That they should be proud to bear it on their foreheads. Being as close to her uncle and cousin as she was, Hinata had never really bought into that. She remembered Niji's dismay and her uncle's pain when he got branded at the mere age of 4, noticed the way with which many members of branch families looked at those of the main family in disdain, and had even witnessed her father using it to subdue her uncle when she was still young. How could anyone think that seal was a good thing after having seen all of that? However, maybe things hadn't always been that way. Maybe when it was first introduced, it had been something to be proud of. Their clan had been in a time of trouble, with its members being kidnapped or killed and their eyes being stolen. However, those with the caged bird seal could fight to protect their families without being afraid of eventually being used against them in one way or another. Their eyes would automatically be destroyed upon their death, and even if they were captured and unable to either free or kill themselves while held at a faraway place, their clan head could still release them from the fate that would have awaited them in captivity. Therefore, they were safe to fight with all they had and without any restraint. There had been a head family even back then, of course, but had there been main and branch families as well, or had that system only come later because of the seal? Had they once upon a time been protectors and honorable members of the clan rather than servants? Heroes that were to be honored rather than people to be looked down on? Was it maybe the way the seal was used rather than the seal itself that was the problem? No, Hinata whispered, not even quite aware that she had spoken that out loud at all. Even if the creation of the seal came from a place of good intention, it doesn't justify its continued use. At the end of the day, shinobi were tools. Just as they had been tools for their clans in the past, they were tools for their villages today, but that didn't mean they weren't also humans. Even if their profession meant they had to serve as weapons, as an extension of their village's will, they still deserved to be free. Regardless of what the initial intentions might have been, a fundamental part of the caged bird seal was the ability of the head family to seal the branded person's eyes and even kill them with nothing but a single hand seal. If it only activated upon death to destroy the Byakugan, it maybe could be a force of good, but as it was now, it was a tool to, and there was no other way to put it, enslave their own kinsmen. It was then that she remembered her sensei's earlier words. I understand why they created it, but I still think it's wrong and needs to be abolished. Then, suddenly, and before she had any more time to think about this, she jerked back with a little yelp as something flicked against her forehead. Well done, Itaka-sensei said with a warm smile, hand still extended without even trying to hide what he had just done. I told you that you already knew the answer to your question, didn't I? Hinata opened her mouth, but no words came out. She could feel a blush sneak up her face, his gesture so similar to how she treated Hanabi that it left her speechless, and after another futile attempt to speak up, all she could do was avert her face and look literally everywhere but at him. Mercifully, he didn't address her behavior. Do you want to stick to your goal of abolishing the seal, then? Yes, she nodded, grateful for the distraction. I'm not sure how to do it yet, but I will not give up. While she tried to hide it, she didn't feel as confident as her reply might imply. She would become clan head one day, yes, but even that didn't guarantee that she could succeed with her goal. After all, the Hyuga were one of the few clans whose elders had a lot of influence on clan matters. The clan head was still the highest authority, of course, and they couldn't be pushed around even by the elders, but they had a lot of influence that could be used against her nevertheless. There had never been a case where a clan head of the Hyuga clan got overthrown and replaced, but that didn't mean that such attempts hadn't been made at all. The elders were usually the heads of the various main families, being second only in standing to the head family, and none of them would be happy about losing their standing and power over those they thought of as lesser. Considering Hinata's strongest, and possibly only, supporters in her quest to abolish the caged bird seal were the branch families who were the ones being branded with it, that was certainly a problem. After all, While only the head family could use the seal to kill or permanently destroy a branded person's Byakugan, every head of one of the main families could use it to hurt and temporarily incapacitate them. Should they decide to take action against her, she would be left without support. The only way she saw right now was seeking help from the Hokage, but that was a risky move for a wide variety of reasons, so if anything, that was an absolute last resort. Then, as if he was reading her mind, Itachi-sensei spoke up again. I can't promise that they will be able to help, but I know a few people who are very well versed in both Fuinjutsu and Juinjutsu. If you wish, I can introduce you to them. Hinata's head whirled around, her previous embarrassment all but forgotten. Really? Of course. She was so caught up in the situation that she didn't even notice the odd look that flashed across his face, a slip-up he wouldn't usually do. Her excitement quickly diminished once she realized that no matter how skilled the people he knew might be, she couldn't take the risk. Thank you, Sensei, she said softly, trying and probably failing to hide her disappointment. However, I can't take you up on that offer. The risk is too high. The caged bird seal is set to activate the moment anyone tries to mess with it, you see, so. Hinata could most likely find someone willing to play guinea pig quite easily if she wanted to. There were more than enough of her clansmen that were desperate enough to risk their lives for even the slightest chance of freedom, and even many of those who weren't too bitter about their lot in life might be willing to take the risk if it meant their children and grandchildren would have it better than them. But just because they might be willing to do so didn't mean she was as well. Even if it was ultimately their decision, she would always feel guilty for every death that occurred because she gave them hope, potentially even false hope. She just couldn't justify that to herself. It would probably be better to just abolish the system by forbidding any more children to be branded and avoiding using the seal against those that already are. So there's no sealing formula, then? Hinata blinked. Then, that's right, she exclaimed, clasping her hands together in front of her. There is. The sealing formula was used by the clan head to teach their heirs how to apply the seal, so while her father hadn't taught it to her yet, she knew it did in fact exist. So if I show it to your acquaintances, they could decipher it and find a way to release it. Again, I can't make any promises, he said with a soft chuckle, but Hinata was too excited to feel embarrassed about his apparent amusement about her mood swings. They might find a way, but they just as well might not. It's impossible to say. But there is a chance, right? He nodded, and that was more than enough for her. It was more hope than anything she had ever had before. They sat in silence after that, both of them lost in thoughts. Or maybe that was just her and he was merely giving her time to sort out her mind. Regardless, it didn't really matter. Hinata was just happy for the short respite. It was when she began to calm down a few minutes later that she realized how utterly ridiculous their conservation was. For all that the different clans had ultimately the best interest of Konoha in mind, there was obviously still some rivalry between them. These rivalries were mainly about who could produce the most powerful and accomplished shinobi, and who could get the most influence within the village. This influence was mostly unofficial, of course, like being able to influence public opinion due to their reputation, but also included having their members hold important positions in the village's administration. Being close to the Hokage to the point where one could potentially serve as an advisor was also one way to gain influence. The more established, old families like Konoha's four noble clans were a bit more relaxed in that respect as their standing was pretty secure with their clan heads being automatically part of the Hokage's closest council, but even they still tried to keep their reputation high by producing strong shinobi and having their members take important positions. If Hinata remembered correctly, a civilian Uchiha had become the head of Konoha's merchant guild not too long ago, for example. Her father had been in a bad mood all week when that had been announced. Some other clans like the Inyazuka, on the other hand, didn't participate in any power games, partly because they didn't really care as long as they weren't put at a disadvantage and partly because they knew their unique skills were too useful to risk antagonizing them. However, other clans that were only recently founded, had relatively small numbers, or just didn't have any outstanding members were much more aggressive. All of them wanted to become more prominent and influential, and for that, they were ready to even sabotage each other. The village strictly forbade actual infighting, of course, and even the slightest suspicion of things like assassinations was thoroughly investigated and, eventually, harshly punished. That didn't stop them from trying to snatch the best missions for themselves or slandering each other, though, although the latter had to be done with great care because the village's leadership didn't want too much discontent towards its shinobi among the population. A good example of one clan that had become significantly more influential over the last 20 years was the Yamanaka clan. They had a relatively long history, spanning nearly a century before the hidden villages were even founded, but they had never been particularly numerous or powerful. They were clever, however, and stayed out of most of the power games played by other clans until they attained the reputation of being a reliable and neutral party. This, together with their generations-long friendship with the Akimichi and Nara clans as well as their outstanding results in the field over a long period of time, was enough to make them one of the most well-known and most established families in Konoha. Anyway, what she was trying to say was that for all that both the Uchiha and the Hyuga were much more relaxed due to their secure standing within the village, they were still rivals of sorts, especially because they were both overly prideful of their respective dojutsu. Talking about the darker parts of their families and planning on working together to put an end to one of her clan's oldest traditions was definitely not something people like them should do. After all, the two were not just anyone but the heirs of their respective clans. And yet Hinata didn't feel guilty at all. Maybe it was foolish of her, but it was the first time she had real hope of actually achieving her goal. For all that she had wished to abolish her clan's practice of brand marking nearly 3/4 of its members, she had never had any real idea of how to do it. It seemed only more and more impossible the more she thought about it. She trusted Itaka-sensei, so if speaking with him about this was what it took to finally find a potential solution, she was happy with it. And if she one day came to regret it, well, she could still worry about that if it ever actually came to that. Chapter 69, The Hideout 4. Let's start this from the beginning. The Hideout 4. They had decided early on that it would be best to wait for their assailants to attack them at the Uchiha hideout rather than risk being attacked again on the road when they eventually continued their journey home, or perhaps even to seek them out themselves. That this was the safest approach. Naruto wasn't necessarily a fan of sitting idly by and twiddling his thumbs, very much preferring a more proactive approach himself, but he at least understood why they did it. After all, only an idiot would fail to realize how advantageous it would be to defend themselves in the fortress compared to all the problems they would face on the road. Not that he thought these bandits were much of a threat unless they somehow managed to get one of them all alone by themselves, mind you, but it didn't hurt to be safe. Besides, ever since he saw the corpse of one enemy he had killed during their first ambush, Naruto somehow didn't feel quite as motivated to go and seek a fight anyway. He didn't even feel mad about how boring the mission had been anymore. No, it was much better to wait for them here and prepare for their inevitable attack. And prepare they did. Pretty much everything they had done since they came here was for the sake of preparing for this fight. Even Itaka's history lessons played a role as he used them to point out to them just how defensible this place was. When they weren't eating or sleeping, they were training in ever-rotating groups to improve their teamwork with either Itaka or Kakashi-sensei, guarding and scouting the area, or setting up traps, lots and lots of traps. By now, they were more than ready for the approaching fight. Which meant none of them panicked when the warn system Shino had put into place with his bugs, and Naruto still thought it sucked the other group had come up with something so cool instead of his own, suddenly went off on the 5th day of their stay, announcing the arrival of their enemies. Not even the fact that they apparently approached from several directions at once did anything to deter them. They had a plan, after all. "All right," he exclaimed, the anticipation and adrenaline that shot through his veins dispelling most of his unease. "Let's do this." Shino and Sasuke, who were currently the only ones with him, nodded determinedly at that. Naruto crossed his fingers in a single hand seal. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. Shadow Clone Technique. While there were a number of ways to enter the hideout, there was only one entrance at the foot of the terraced mountain, and that was where Naruto was currently lying in wait. Or to be more precise, it was there that 8 Narutos were currently lying in wait, with 5 of them outside the entrance on the terrace above it and the remaining 3 on the inside a bit further down the corridor. And none of them was the real one. "I really wish there would be a few more of us," his fellow clone murmured to his right. "Not that we can't beat these idiots on our own, mind you, but some additional fists would have been nice." He nodded, absently blowing his hair out of his face and pushing away a twig from the bush they were hiding in that was dangerously close to poking his eye out. Yeah, but you know the rules. Knowing Kakashi-sensei, he's somewhere around here watching us just in case we do anything we aren't allowed to. Exactly, another clone said. And even if he isn't, he could probably tell at a glance that we did something we weren't supposed to anyway. Better not risk it. The remaining two clones of their group nodded at that. It's still a stupid rule, he thought a little grumpily. I mean, I get it. I shouldn't depend too much on this technique and it could have consequences or whatever if I abuse it too much, but not being allowed to create more than 10 clones at a time sucks big time. He quickly dismissed these thoughts when their enemies finally came into view, though. There were only a few at first, advancing slowly towards the wide-open entrance of the hideout with tensed muscles and alert expressions on their faces, but little by little, more and more appeared. They were smart enough to split up into small groups instead of traveling in one big one, so their total number was initially hard to guess, but as the minutes passed, Naruto's eyebrows rose higher and higher. Shino really didn't lie when he said this is the biggest group, huh? According to the other boy, 4 groups were advancing on the hideout from 4 different directions right now, and the one Naruto and his fellow clones were facing here was supposed to be the most numerous one. Considering he was counting over 30 bandits so far, he could easily believe that. They were advancing slowly and cautiously, obviously wary of potential traps and ambushes, and some of them even threw narrow-eyed looks up the terrace where Naruto's group was hiding, but when the first ones managed to walk through the entrance unhindered, the rest began to collectively relax. Soon after, they all began to let their guard down and rush forward. Just as planned. Naruto waited until about half of the 36 enemies in total had entered the fortress before he drew a kunai with an attached explosion tag. Tags created by the Shadow Clone technique didn't actually work, so this one had been specifically given to him by the original for this one purpose. He threw it high into the air, away from the hideout. The moment it exploded, every single bandit jumped around with drawn weapons and fell into stances ready to fight, but that wasn't the important part. No, while distracting them and making them look away from the fortress and, by association, the terraces he and the other clones were hiding on was a nice plus. The real purpose was to give the clones hiding inside the hideout the signal to let the trap snap shut. Barely a second after the explosion, a large portion of the corridor's ceiling behind the entrance came crashing down as one of the clones on the inside triggered the hidden mechanism that allowed one to open or close the entrance as one pleased, separating the bandits into 2 groups and hopefully even crushing some of them before they had a chance to flee. Naruto tried not to think too much about how the bodies would look like if they had indeed gotten crushed. Being distracted by 2 surprising events instead of one now, none of the bandits noticed the 5 Naruto clones that had jumped to the edge of the terrace. Futon, Tappa. Wind Release, Breakthrough. This was currently the only elemental ninjutsu he knew, and at first, he had been far from happy with it. After all, while it would probably knock an enemy out if they stood close to him, it wouldn't do more than knock someone off their feet if they were a bit further away. He had warmed up to it when he saw what it could do in combination with Sasuke's fire release techniques, however, and Kakashi-sensei's promise to teach him a stronger technique based on this one once they were back at Konoha did the rest. Fortunately, it was more than enough for their current purposes. 5 gusts of wind smashed into the group of about 20 bandits, throwing several of them to the ground and unbalancing several more, which made them easy targets to the shuriken that quickly followed. It wasn't quite as successful as Naruto would have liked, though, with more of them being able to escape than anticipated. I guess they're not too bad, eh? He thought, intentionally ignoring the bodies of those they had hit with their weapons. This was not the time to hesitate. With a cry, the 5 of them jumped down the terrace and into the fray. Their opponents should still be at least somewhat disoriented, so they had to seize this opportunity before it passed. As long as they hit hard and fast, this shouldn't be too much of a problem, and even if they couldn't beat all of them before being destroyed, everything would be alright as long as they beat enough to discourage the rest to continue forward. The 3 clones on the inside would do the same with those that had already entered the hideout, too. Just as this thought crossed his mind, one of his fellow clones let out a strangled cry before dispersing in a white plume of smoke as an arrow shot from the woods hit him straight in the chest. There are more of them still hiding. He realized just as his feet touched the ground, feeling annoyance building up in his chest. Damn it, we really should have checked the area before jumping down, shouldn't we? 4 of them had successfully managed to get down, so it wasn't the end of the world, but it certainly was annoying. At least Sasuke isn't here. He would never let me live this down. Now as long as Kakashi-sensei wasn't hiding somewhere around here to see that either, everything would be fine. With that final thought, the 4 of them jumped toward their remaining opponents. No. Stay away from me, don't come any closer. I am warning you guys. Sakura's words were muffled and distorted to Kiba's ears, but considering he was currently hiding under the floor's surface, that was only to be expected. In fact, it was only because of his keen senses and because Sakura was raising her voice so much that he could hear anything at all. The only thing he usually had to orientate himself when he was underground were vibrations, so it was actually kinda nice. He took that back a second later when she shrieked loud enough that it hurt even him. Kiba almost felt sorry for the bandits who were in the same corridor as her and for whom it must have been so much worse. The emphasis being on almost. If he didn't feel bad for them for being led into a trap, he certainly wouldn't feel bad for them just because their eardrums had burst. Then he felt all the vibrations suddenly stop as if every single person in the corridor above him had come to a halt at the same time, and recognizing this as his signal, he burst out from the floor on the opposite end of the corridor with the group of 13 bandits sprawled right between him and Sakura. Kiba allowed himself to savor the sight of more than a dozen men appearing as if they had frozen in mid-motion for a moment before snapping himself back to the present and lunging at them with an exclamation of "Tsuga" on his lips. With the corridor being as narrow as it was, and the bandits being in no position to even attempt to dodge, let alone actually block his attack, he was able to smash through the entire group in one go, knocking them all out in under 3 seconds and coming to a halt next to a panting Sakura. Well, he drawled without bothering to hide how satisfied he felt at their success. That was kinda underwhelming. Sakura, who was still breathing hard, chuckled a bit at that. Yeah, well, falling right into our trap is the least they could do after I put all that energy into my performance. Sure, anything else would have just been rude, really, he agreed jokingly. Then, his lips quirked up into a sly grin. Although being a damsel in distress must be much more strenuous than I imagined if your wheezing is anything to go by. I want to see you try and convince a bunch of people whose friends you have been beaten for weeks now that you're only an innocent small girl rather than some kind of threat. I felt like a total idiot stumbling around like that and screeching like some kind of banshee. He raised his arms in surrender, but the smirk that was still on his face probably ruined the effect of it. Yeah, I get it. Your job was super hard and mine was a walk in the park. Well done. The look she shot him could have frozen hell, but he saw the way her lips tucked upwards against her will, so she clearly knew he was only joking around and played along. Anyway, he continued after a few seconds with a glance at their fallen enemies, catching so many of them in a genjutsu at once is actually really impressive. Although Hinata was the only one who took Itaka-sensei up to his offer to teach us some genjutsu, Shino and I had neither the right talent nor interest for it. When we became his students, he still taught us some of the basics, and I'm pretty sure he mentioned that using it on several people was extraordinarily more difficult than using it on only one, even if the technique in question was comparably simple. Sakura's face immediately brightened with what Kiba recognized as pride at his words. It is. You didn't really think I am that exhausted just because I had to run away from them for a bit, did you? Then, her expression turned somewhat sheepish. I could only catch all of them because of the circumstances, though. They might have some rudimentary chakra control, yes, but they clearly lack the skill to even try and break free, so they didn't resist like a shinobi would have. It's also great that the corridor is so narrow because that means I can see all of them and they stand close together. She sighed. I wouldn't have been able to pull this off on an open field, for example. He shrugged, not really caring about the details. And hey, they might have lured them into this narrow corridor because that would be advantageous for his attack, but if it gave her an advantage as well, that was great, right? It's still pretty cool. I couldn't have done that, at least. Her bright smile in response somehow made that offhand comment feel much more important than it was meant to be. Before either of them had the chance to say anything else, the telltale sound of snapping ninja wire, flying weapons, and the screams of injured men from a nearby corridor distracted them. It seems some of them fell into one of Akamaru's traps, he said before turning back towards Sakura with a cocky grin. Ready for round 2? Her expression mirrored his. You bet. Without further ado, Kiba vanished once more underground while Sakura fell back into her role as a helpless little girl. How much further? Only 2 more turns, Hinata replied to Sasuke's question, her voice just as quiet as his to avoid being heard. Remember, we dash. He dismissively waved with his hand to interrupt her. I know. I was there when we came up with the plan, remember? She felt a tingle of annoyance in the back of her head but suppressed the instinctive reaction to frown in favor of a simple nod. They had been at the hideout for only a few days, but that had been enough time for her to get a rudimentary idea of Sasuke's character. Much more than their time at the academy had ever done, at least. Therefore, she knew that he didn't mean to be rude even if it seemed that way. Although that doesn't make it any less annoying. She was probably just too used to the calmer and more polite atmosphere of her own team, Hinata reasoned. Between them and the mostly polite and distant interactions she had at home, she had most likely just forgotten how brash and unintentionally rude many of her classmates from the academy could be at times. She conveniently ignored the fact that Kiba could and regularly was exactly the same. I still wish he would be a bit more like Ataka-sensei, though. Regardless, she had no more time to think about any of this before they reached the corridor where the 4 men she had spotted earlier with her Byakugan were and subsequently were forced to fight. They unfortunately faced in their direction as they arrived, so knocking them out before they even noticed them was out of the question. With there being only 4 of them, however, it wasn't as if they would pose much of a challenge, so that was more of a minor nuisance than an actual problem. Just as planned, Sasuke threw a bunch of shuriken the moment they arrived in the corridor. The 4 men avoided them by dodging with impossible fluidly for a civilian, but compared to a shinobi, their movements were still clunky and rushed, meaning they were in no way prepared to face her and Sasuke as they suddenly appeared in front of them. Hinata ducked beneath the punch of the first man and, while making sure to keep him between her and the second one as some kind of meat shield, jabbed her fingers in quick succession into his chest to close half a dozen tenketsu. The impact of it was enough to throw him back, and hadn't the man behind him managed to jump to the side in time, he would have been knocked off his feet as well. However, while he managed to avoid that fate, the brief distraction was more than enough for Hinata to close the distance between them and seal his fate the same way she did with her previous opponent. She took a moment to give the 2 fallen men a closer look to check if any of her attacks had been inaccurate enough to accidentally damage any internal organs, and upon confirming that they hadn't, felt a surge of satisfaction and pride swell up within her. There was no time for this, though, so she instead turned towards Sasuke. Due to her Byakugan, she had been able to observe his fight while taking care of her own opponents, so it didn't come as a surprise when she turned around to the sight of one man with 2 broken arms lying unconsciously on the floor. She was also just in time to witness him smashing his second opponent's head against the wall with a gruesome crunching sound. Judging from the grimace on his face, he most likely hadn't meant to push so hard. At the very least, he seemed to regret it. However, Hinata didn't point out the discomfort either of them felt at the sight, for both their sakes. Instead, she said, there are 3 more just a few corridors from here. We should hurry before they join forces with another group. He gave her a curt nod, expression somewhat more open than before as he realized what she was doing, and then gestured for her to lead the way. Then, they were off again. While all of their teammates had been given specific areas of the hideout to protect, Hinata and Sasuke were a bit different. Instead of some allocated area, they were tasked with hunting down whatever smaller teams split off the main forces in an attempt to be more sneaky. Due to her eyes, that wasn't too hard, especially because they could ignore large parts of the building. After all, she knew for a fact that their enemies had entered from only 4 points. The 3 larger groups were taken care of by their teammates, so all they had to worry about was the smallest group that had entered from an entrance on one of the eastern terraces. It was somewhat tiresome to run around for what usually were only 3 of 4 opponents at a time, of course, especially because a good number of them got themselves beaten by some traps they had set up in advance before they could even reach them and thus made much of their running unnecessary, but Hinata was fine with that. Her skill set, her dojutsu, was best suited for this task, so it was only natural she would be responsible for it. It would have been nice to work with someone I got along with better, though. Shino had always thought that Kiba and Naruto were quite similar. After all, he knew from their years of friendship that both were loudmouths who couldn't sit still for more than a minute and were always out for a fight, albeit admittedly only in a playful manner. Most of the time, at least. Being on a team with Kiba for a while now, he could see that this assessment might have been incomplete. Yes, they were certainly both hyperactive loudmouths and no day went by without both of them getting into some kind of heated argument, but at the end of the day, that wasn't all they were. Kiba, for example, could sit still for longer periods of time. He had proven that during many of their training sessions when he kept hiding motionlessly in some bush or tree for hours. He had a lot more brain power than Shino would have given him credit for in the past, too, and regularly caught him by surprise with some clever trick or insightful comment. And as Shino had noticed during the last few days, Naruto was similar. None of his prior opinions about the other boy were necessarily wrong, but they lacked the nuance to completely assess him. Shino had only known the two boys when they were all in the academy or went out to play, though, so it made sense. There were characteristics he had never witnessed because they had never been in a situation in which they would have had to demonstrate them. It was only now that he had been on a team with one and saw the other during a mission that he could truly begin to understand them. Regardless, no matter what else he might find out about them going forward, one thing would probably always hold true. They were both far too loud. Come on, guys. Don't tell me you can't keep up with me. Maybe you'd be better off just giving up already and going home. Naruto's voice echoed through the corridors and into the chamber Shino was currently hiding in, shortly followed by the angry shouts of several men. It was quite telling that Naruto was many times louder than even the group of grown-up men, too. His screaming did its job, though, and contrary to what Shino might have expected, the baits seemed to motivate the pursuers even further instead of discouraging them. How foolish, he thought. Shouldn't they grow suspicious that the target they're pursuing doesn't seem afraid at all and even has the time and energy to ridicule them? Not that he was complaining, of course, but he still found their carelessness embarrassing to witness. Not 1 minute later, Naruto stormed into the chamber, 12 men hot on his heels. Once they had all entered and he could be sure that no more enemies were coming, Shino, standing upside down on the ceiling, instructed some of his Kikaicho to activate the mechanism that sealed the chamber's only entrance and exit shut. Naruto joined him at the celling a moment later, just when the men began to realize what had happened. What the dash? Oh no, you won't dash. Shit. This is a trap. Shino paid their exclamations no mind as he directed all the Kikaicho that had been silently hiding in the chamber's many long shadows to attack. One moment, the men were screaming profanities at them, and 1 moment later, these screams changed into ones of fear and terror as swarms of insects closed in on them from all directions. It was over in less than a minute, and while Shino continued to pay close attention in case one of the bandits decided to throw a weapon at them, he needn't have bothered. No one did. In the end, they were all helpless in face of an adversary they couldn't hope to beat or even just fight. Yeah, Naruto said with a long look at the unconscious bodies on the floor after the two of them let themselves fall down from the ceiling, this never stops being super creepy. He nudged one of the men with his foot. Remember me to never get on your bad side, would ya? You're a shinobi. If you had been in their position, you could probably have avoided the first wave and then come up with some plan to defend yourself. Really not the point, man. Shino knew that, of course, and he was very glad that his high collar concealed his smirk. As much as he hated that most people's first reaction to his clan's techniques was usual disgust and unease, he did occasionally enjoy creeping people out with them, not that he would ever admit that out loud, mind you. The good thing with doing so with Naruto was that the other boy always got over it within seconds and never held a grudge, so Shino didn't even have to feel bad about it later. Case in point. Anyway, Naruto exclaimed, already back to normal, this went great. I can't believe they were really that stupid and followed me without a second's hesitation. Shino nodded, having thought the same just a bit earlier himself. I heard that civilians regularly underestimate genin because of their young age, but the extent to which they do so appears to be more extreme than I imagined. Naruto snorted. What? They think we can't beat them up just because we're children? Come on, guys, we're shinobi. Of course we're stronger than you. People that don't live in hidden villages and don't regularly interact with shinobi seem to struggle to reconcile their expectations with reality as dash. Hey, do you think our clones finished their fights already as well? Shino couldn't even bring himself to be annoyed at Naruto's careless interruption, knowing the other boy genuinely didn't mean anything malicious by it. It wasn't his fault that he was an idiot. I suspect one of your clones would have been destroyed if they had any problems, so I suppose they did. Apparently, Naruto's shadow clones could actually transfer their memories when they got destroyed, and while most details seemed to get lost in that transfer, they would at least alert them that something had gone wrong. As that didn't happen, things should be fine. Naruto had told him that the memory transfer got more complicated the more clones he used, but there were currently only 2 other clones working together with 2 of Shino's insect clones, so that shouldn't be a problem. Although he does have several other clones fighting elsewhere, too, he mused before dismissing that thought. According to Naruto, he was used enough to that number to notice if one was destroyed, so worrying about this was a waste of time. Good, Naruto said, and Shino grew immediately suspicious at the faux innocent voice he was using. That proved to be smart when the other boy grinned at him and asked, "So are there any more enemies left? We didn't finish them all off already, did we?" He suppressed a sigh at the hopeful tone, but dutifully, he raised a finger for some of his Kikaicho to land on. Then, a few seconds later, there seemed to be 2 more small groups in our section. Our clones are closer to the southern one, but the other one is not far from here, so dash. Alright, let's go. Naruto didn't give him any chance to reply before starting to run, making Shino not only regret that he had ordered his Kikaicho to open the exit a bit earlier but also make him lose his composure for the first time. Naruto, he exclaimed while falling into a run himself, pointedly ignoring the way his voice cracked as he did so. Stop. You don't even know where they are. Infuriatingly, the other boy just laughed with no intention of slowing down anytime soon. Akira Kurosawa impatiently tapped one finger on his knee as he waited for his men to return, preferably with the dem scroll he had told them to bring with them, too. Seriously, how hard could it be to beat a bunch of children? Sure, there were 6 of them now instead of the initial 3, but still. Shouldn't they have been overwhelmed by now? It wasn't as if he thought any of his men were close to being even just equal to any of them. Children or not, they were still shinobi. However, with their numerical superiority, they should be more than capable of beating them. Compensating for the losses they would most certainly suffer was somewhat annoying, yes, but at the end of the day, that wasn't a major concern for him. People willing to first study under and then serve him were as numerous as the stars in the sky. Just give them some food, convince them of all the opportunities they would have under his command, and maybe show off a little. That's all it took for people to do whatever he told them to. Oh, the poor were always so delightfully easy to manipulate. Akira had grown up on the streets himself. He had been just one street urchin among many. However, he had been fortunate enough to catch the eye of a passing missing nin who was willing to teach him how to mold and control chakra as long as he worked for him. Naturally, he had immediately agreed. The missing nin died not too long after, but by then, Akira had the basics down well enough to improve on his own. He would never be as strong as a shinobi, of course, and he didn't know any ninjutsu or genjutsu, but he could use chakra to strengthen his body. Against any civilian, that was more than enough to guarantee his victory in a fight. After a while, he began teaching others how to use chakra as well. He remembered his teacher telling him that one had to start studying young if one wanted to have any chance of ever becoming truly powerful in life, and that those who only started as adults would never be able to master even the most basic techniques, so Akira naturally only took adults as students. Even the little they could learn was enough to put them above regular people, meaning they were still useful to him, but at the same time, they would never become a true threat to him. Even if all of them worked together, Akira would be able to beat them, or at the very least be capable of outrunning them if he had to. It was because he had studied under an actual shinobi that Akira understood that even these genin, who were only beginners themselves, would be able to win every fair 1-versus-1 against any of his men and even himself. Against wave after wave of them for several days and even weeks, on the other hand, that should theoretically be enough to beat them. So why aren't they back yet? He wondered with a frown. Did I underestimate these kids? It is the first time I actually dare to attack ninja, after all, even if they're just a bunch of children. I even made sure that they were alone without an adult supervisor. All scouts agreed on that, and none of those that fought against them and survived has seen one either. As if to mock him, it was then that a voice spoke up from directly behind his back. Oh my, staying back with only 3 guards? Maybe you're a bit braver than I thought. Akira was proud to say that his first reaction was to jump to his feet and lash out with a knife he had drawn in the blink of an eye. Unfortunately, things didn't work out as planned, and a second later, he found himself lying on the ground with his face pressed down and his arms twisted behind his back. What the desh, he gasped, but before he could finish the question, his face was pressed deeper into the dirt to stop him. Please, don't overexert yourself, the same voice said uncomfortably close to his ear. We're going to have a nice long talk later, so there's no reason to be impatient. We have all the time in the whole world. He couldn't see the other person, only spotting some strands of silver hair out of the corner of his eye, but that wasn't his main priority right now. With a burst of strength that stemmed from pure desperation, he pushed his face to the side and yelled guards, while ignoring the dirt in his mouth. Guards, what are you doing? Help me. However, no one came to his aid. Oh, you're not talking about those 3 over there, I hope. Akira's face was forcefully moved to look to his left. They're already dead, I'm afraid. My condolences. Just as the voice said, his 3 guards were lying in a pile of limbs with their throats cut, all of them sharing the same confused expression on their faces as if they hadn't even realized what had happened to them before they died. Akira had no way to confirm who it was that had sneaked up on him, and he doubted the other man would tell him even if he asked, but deep down, he knew that he must somehow be associated with the children his remaining men were currently fighting. Deep down, he now realized that messing with ninja, no matter how young, had been a grave mistake. Likely his last mistake, too. I wish I had just stayed in bed this morning. Chapter 70, No Place Like Home. Let's start this from the beginning. No place like home. It seems like you've had a pretty tough time, although I expect you will look back on this mission fondly sooner rather than later. Shino nodded, wholeheartedly agreeing with his father's words. Or, well, at least the first half of them. He somewhat doubted he would ever think of this past month as anything other than strenuous and distressing. I suppose it was too much to hope that you wouldn't fall victim to the curse as well, his mother added with a sigh as she joined him and his father at the table after setting down the steaming plates with their dinner in front of them, her fur in a barame, untypical fair hair put up in a bun and eyes gleaming in a mixture of exasperation and amusement. It would have been nice if things hadn't escalated quite so much, though. Shino couldn't deny that the thick, savory aroma of the food in front of him was very distracting. His team had returned less than an hour ago, and all he had managed to do in that time was to take a long overdue shower before joining his parents for an early dinner. They had been gone for a bit over a month, and while the food at their client's mansion had been anything but bad, he had still missed his mother's homemade food. Nevertheless, her remark made him perk up. A curse. His father let out one of his rare laughs. Whenever a Genin team has its first C-rank mission, something goes wrong. It has become something akin to a tradition over the years. Given the fact that people like to gossip and make up stories that have little to do with reality, it should come as no surprise that someone decided to call this phenomenon a curse, or that people still cling to it to this day. Shino felt that was something he should have been told about before he set off for his mission. It's usually nothing as major as what happened to you, his mother said between 2 bites. From what I've heard, it's usually small inconveniences like having to take detours or somehow, and inexplicitly, ending at a completely wrong location. Running into a bunch of missing nins and getting involved with a group of bandits? That's rather extreme, I think. His father nodded. It is. The only comparable case I can think of is what happened when Sandaime Sama took his team on their first C-rank mission. Stories like these always remind me why I'm glad I never became a kunoichi myself. From there, dinner continued like it always did, with his parents doing most of the talking and him listening and only occasionally commenting. It was almost like he had never left. In a way, it was truly soothing to see that things hadn't changed in his absence. 1 month wasn't all that long in the great scheme of things, of course, but at the end of the day, it was still the longest he had ever been away from home. He didn't mind admitting that he had grown homesick during the latter parts of his mission. At least in the privacy of his mind, that is. He certainly would never admit it out loud. However, things couldn't stay idle forever. The turning point was when they had all finished eating and his mother began to clear the table. Shino was just about to stand up to help her when his father stopped him with a simple wave of his hand. He didn't say a word, but he didn't have to for Shino to understand what he wanted. They remained silent for a few more seconds before his father finally began to speak, his voice more serious than before. I expect you're aware that the technique you used against your opponent isn't one written down in our clan's records. Shino nodded. Considering it was something he had come up with himself, that much was obvious. Traditionally speaking, our family always refined the skills and abilities we already had instead of trying to develop completely new ones, his father continued. We did that too, of course, and just like everyone else, we constantly keep our eyes open for ways to increase our abilities even further, but it has never been our priority, and fire has always been our greatest nemesis. With the benefit of hindsight, and after hearing what you have been able to achieve, that might have been a mistake. That approach has served our clan well, Shino said while trying to hide his rising excitement at where the conversation was apparently heading. Calling it a mistake when it brought us where we're today seems a bit much. Maybe so, but the fact remains that it was a clear oversight. A pause. One which I plan to rectify. Normally, these words would have made Shino glow with pride. After all, it wasn't every day that one changed the way a clan approached their abilities. However, something on his father's face stopped him from giving in to his excitement completely, and that caution paid off shortly after. However, it also remains true that neither I nor anyone else in the clan has any idea how to incorporate fire nature into our techniques yet. You understand what this means, don't you? Shino did. It means you won't be able to help me train. However, much to his surprise, his father shook his head. Not quite. It means that I won't be able to teach you anything in that regard. I do plan to help you train, however. I'm sure between the two of us, we will be able to find some creative use for your chakra nature. Now that finally made him crack. Really? Shino held no illusions that he could hide from his father how excited he was even if he tried, and while that usually meant he would be embarrassed about being so transparent in front of him, he couldn't bring himself to care right now. Really, his father confirmed. I have to admit that when you announced your interest in learning more advanced taijutsu instead of focusing more on our family's techniques, I was disappointed because I wouldn't be able to help you as much as I would have liked to. Close combat is just not something I excel at. This, on the other hand, is something I can help you with, and I very much intend to do so. Shino remembered that day. Both his parents had told him that they would support him if that's what he wanted to do, but they also reminded him that it wasn't something they could help him with beyond a certain point. Back then, he hadn't cared or even thought much about it, but now, he could see why his father might have been disappointed. He also remembered how close his fight with Kuzan had been. Yes, the missing nin was older and much more experienced than him, but the fact remained that Shino had been completely outmatched by him. It had taken all he had to just defend himself and stay alive. His talk with Itaka-sensei at the Uchiha hideout had helped, and Shino was proud of how far he had come in the short time he was a genin, but maybe the fight would have turned out differently if he had just spent more time practicing clan techniques with his father. It was then that he made up his mind. It was somewhat embarrassing to ask his father to teach him more traditional techniques when he had spent the last few years focusing primarily on more unorthodox approaches, but seeing his usually controlled and collected facade break first into a shocked and then a happy expression definitely made it worth it. Hiruzen usually didn't visit prisoners. He rarely had reason to, after all. However, the current situation was somewhat special, and while circumstances didn't exactly force him to take this step, he had decided to do so nevertheless. The top security cells were located deep underground. Getting there meant one had to walk through countless convoluted and intricate corridors that were lined with traps and guards, and even he as Hokage couldn't pass through them without going through several identity checks first. All in all, it took a bit over half an hour to reach his target even though he had taken the shortest possible path, hadn't dodged, and had taken advantage of every benefit his position brought with it. The person he intended to seek out didn't necessarily require such high security. Having been beaten by a relatively fresh genin in a fight proved that her strength wasn't anything worth writing home about, and not even the fact that the genin in question was the heir of one of Konoha's most prestigious clans and had therefore enjoyed more training than most others her age changed that. However, due to the information she might possess, it had been decided to put her here just in case. It has come to my attention that you wish to speak with me. The woman sitting in one corner of the cell hadn't reacted when the door opened or even when two of his Umbu guards entered ahead of him to secure the room, but at the sound of his voice, she raised her head. She was definitely a beautiful woman, no one could argue that point, but almost 2 weeks in a cell had done her appearance no favors. Her shoulder-length orange hair was matted and dull, her eyes looked almost lifeless, and the way her prisoner clothes hung off her did not do a good job of hiding the weight loss she had evidently suffered. No wonder, considering his reports stated that she never finished the already small portions of food that were provided for her. Hokage-sama, Yawaka greeted him, and although her voice was somewhat raspy from a lack of use, Hiruzen noted that she made an effort to sound polite and respectful when speaking to him. I honestly didn't expect you to actually come and see me. And yet here I am. If you have something to say, kindly do so now. My time is not infinite. That was true, of course, but it wasn't as if he terribly minded getting away from his desk for a little bit longer. Perhaps sensing how serious he was, Yawaka got straight to the point. I would like to offer my full and unreserved cooperation. In return, I humbly request that you give me shelter and permission to join your village. Hiruzen gave a thoughtful hum as he considered her words. It wasn't a very surprising offer. In fact, this was exactly what he had expected her to do from the moment when he first heard that she requested to speak with him. And why is it that I should allow a criminal who abandoned their home, family, and comrades to join my village? A simple question, and judging by the small twitch of her lips she failed to suppress, one she had seen coming. That Hyuga girl must have given you a report of our fight, right? I possess my clan's secret technique, and I'm sure you would find a way to make use of that. And if nothing else, well, if she could beat me, here, some genuine bitterness crept into her voice, in a fair fight, some Umbu guards most definitely can make sure I behave. He nodded at that. As previously noted, she wasn't exactly the strongest of fighters. Furthermore, it was also true that he could indeed find a use for her clan's technique and abilities if given the opportunity. As Yawaka had said, Hinata Hyuga had reported her fight against her to him just like her teammates had done for their own fight. According to her, Yawaka had expressed some disdain for how her family had treated her, and it was very likely that this had played a major role in why she had abandoned her home. She had demonstrated a strong dislike for how villages were run in general as well, though, so things were unfortunately not quite that easy. He let her stew for a few more seconds before finally replying. If I accept your terms, you do understand that you will be under strict observation for a long time, don't you? Of course. She was clearly trying to hide it, but the way her eyes lit up as hope returned to them was impossible to miss. You're also aware that a single misstep will result in your prompt execution. I am. Very well, then. When he saw that she was about to open her mouth to reply with a joyous expression on her face, he beat her to it by adding, I will consider it. For now, cooperate with your guards. I will make a decision when the time comes depending on your behavior and the usefulness of the information you provide. It was obvious that she wasn't happy with not getting a clear answer here and now, but after a second or two, she gave her consent with a curt nod, apparently concluding that cooperating was the best option she had at the moment. Having done what he came here for, Hiruzen turned around and left the cell, quickly followed by his guards. Apparently she's capable of acting more reserved and humble if the situation demands it, he mused with a half-smile. There was nothing of the haughty and arrogant behavior Hinata mentioned in her report to be found today. He wasn't complaining, of course. This change of heart made things only easier for him. Technically, he didn't need Yawaka to cooperate. The torture and interrogation force would be more than enough to get everything she knew out of her, and even if she could keep her mouth shut for more than a session or two with Ibiki, Hiruzen very much doubted that she was talented enough to resist the Yamanaka unit with their mind readers. That being said, if he supported her wish for cooperation instead of forcing the issue, there were advantages and opportunities down the line he could make use of. There was, after all, no saying what kind of barriers were placed in her mind to avoid anyone finding out what she knew. In fact, one of the reasons he was so willing to entertain Yawaku's proposal was the fact that Hiken, the leader of the group of missing nins who had been captured by Atake, had proved to be unexpectedly resilient to both conservative interrogations as well as mind reading. Every Jonin worth their salt knew how to resist torture, and most of them had some sort of mental barriers and traps, too. The former because it helped resist interrogations and the latter because it forcefully shut them down even if they tried to spill the beans. The barriers and traps in Hiken's mind were on an entirely different level than what would be considered normal, though. It was the kind of protection that could only be achieved by investing lots of resources and time into it, and if there had been any doubts whether Suna was actually involved in this or not, this proved it. Hiruzen was confident that his men would eventually be able to get the information out of the man, but there was no telling how long that would take. With how little progress there had been made so far, however, it was likely that it would be a while, and while he could speed the process up a bit by permitting more extreme methods, that would also increase the risk of accidentally breaking his mind or springing a trap that then destroyed their prisoner's mind and all the information it held with it. With how important the information he possessed was, especially in light of the quickly approaching Chunin exams and his plans for them, Hiruzen wasn't quite willing to take this risk yet. It was doubtful that Yawaku knew very much, but every piece of information he could get his hand on until Hiken's resistance inevitable broke was essential, particularly because they had already lost one prisoner and all information he potentially held before he had even arrived at Konoha. Guzen, the unexpected survivor of the believed to be extinct Kesho clan and user of crystal release who had been captured by Shino Abarame and Kiba Inyazuka, had managed to take his own life while being transported to Konoha. Usually, Hiruzen would punish the Umbu guards responsible for the transport for allowing that to happen, but in this case, he found it hard to blame them and therefore let them off with little more than a slap on the wrist. All three of the Umbu guards in question had been mere genin during the days of the Third Great Ninja War, meaning they hadn't been taught how to properly restrain crystal release users, and by the time they rose in rank, the Kesho clan had officially gone extinct, so there had been no reason to teach anyone how to do so either. Consequently, none of the restraints put on him had stopped Guzen from piercing his own throat with a summoned crystal. The only thing Hiruzen could possibly blame the Umbu guards for was that they didn't drug him enough to avoid him waking up at all, but considering he had already received a maximum dose, it was very likely that he simply possessed an unexpected and exceptional resistance to the drug that had been used that couldn't have been foreseen. And with his death, all the information he might have known was gone. Technically, a Yamanaka was able to read the mind of a corpse with only minimal information loss as long as the body in question hasn't been dead for too long, but Guzen had apparently arranged a seal that destroyed his brain the moment he died to put inside his head, so that approach was unfortunately not an option. The only positive thing about Guzen's death was that Hiruzen now didn't have to deal with the question of what to do with him after they got the information they wanted out of him. With him being a carrier of a Kekkei Genkai, there would have been options available that Hiruzen as Hokage would have been forced to consider, so while it was a setback that they didn't get the chance to interrogate him, Hiruzen was happy he wouldn't have to make any more unethically decisions than he already did. Hopefully Yawaku knows something substantial. We can't afford to go blind to whatever Suna is up to by the time the guests arrive. There were still several questions remaining, like where all the people of the camp that Shino and Kiba discovered early in their mission had vanished or what had happened to all the supplies that had been stolen over the years. Furthermore, due to the plot only being found out because Ataka's team went on the mission instead of Syudu, Hiruzen also had to investigate him as well to see if he was a traitor in league with Nisshin, Tsunagakuer, or both. To sum it all up, he still had a lot of work to do. My own trump cards come with much worse side effects, too, if that makes you feel any better. Even as Kiba lay with his back on the hard ground, panting like a dog and with a just as exhausted Akamaru resting on his stomach, he could not get his sensei's words out of his head. On some level, he knew that trump cards always had some side effects that rendered them impractical for regular fights and that these side effects were the more severe the more powerful they were, but it had never really hit home to him. Until now, that was. It was only when he heard that his sensei literally risked blindness for using any of his trump cards that Kiba realized how stupid he had been for berating himself for falling unconscious after using his during his and Shino's fight against Guzen. However, Something else he realized was that calling the double-headed wolf transformation his trump card was stupid. Sure, it was currently his strongest technique and therefore deserved that name at least somewhat, but at the end of the day, it was only one of many of his clan's techniques. It was nothing special. All it would take for him to overcome his current predicament was to grow stronger physically, which was why he was already training again even though his team had only been back at Konoha for 2 days and had been given off for the rest of the week by their sensei. Once his body was strong enough, he would not only be able to keep the technique going for longer but also not fall unconscious afterwards. A trump card was characterized by both its strength and its repercussions. So, could he really call it a trump card when it was neither a particularly powerful technique nor had any consequences that couldn't be overcome with what ultimately boiled down to some basic exercising? And if he had no real trump card, what would he do the next time they encountered a strong enemy? How could he protect his team, his friends, when he was the one who needed to be protected? Shino had come up with an entirely original technique even his own clan had never heard about before, while Hinata had managed to beat her opponent all on her own by using not only the Hyuga's gentle fist but ninjutsu and genjutsu as well. What did Kiba have that could compare to that? Nothing. I need some kind of contingency plan, he thought as he stared up at the bright blue sky, absent-mindedly scratching Akamaru behind the ears. It has to be something special. Something that can turn the tide of battle when everything else is lost, but what? All of the sudden, his eyes widened as a thought crossed his mind. A second later, and much to the displeasure of both Akamaru and his tired legs, he jumped to his feet. That's it. Come in, Akamaru, we have places to be. Without even waiting for his companion to reply, he began running towards his house next to his family's training ground, leaving the Ninken no other choice but to rush after him. Ah, Kiba, his mother's voice called out to him from behind. Done with training already? And here I thought you might be up for some new dash. Not now, Kaa-san. I'm busy. Usually, he wouldn't dare rebuff his mother bluntly like that, but right now, he was too excited about his recent idea to care. Indeed, he was also far too engrossed in thought to even turn around, which was why he didn't get to see the confused and baffled expression on her face. All he could think of as he ran into the house, through the floors, past the shrine with his father's picture on it, towards the stairs, and all the way up the attic was how to make his idea become reality. Now, where exactly did Kaa-san put all of his stuff again? Hinata made sure to keep her exhaustion out of her face and her posture as she slowly walked through the compound, greeting everyone she met with a smile and a nod when they appeared busy and holding some small talk if they didn't, regardless of their rank. While her father did generally treat every member of their clan equally and fairly, he would probably scoff at her, as he would call it, wasting so much time for what he perceived as useless activity. After all, what use was it to listen to one of the cooks about what they had planned to make for dinner the next day or about what one of the gardeners had to say about their latest projects? Hinata could almost hear him berate her for not using this time for more productive things like training and improving herself. The fact that she had spent the entire day listening to him explaining the finer details of keeping records for their family's various business enterprises as well as calculating some of the bills herself with him constantly looking over her shoulder would probably do little to appease him either. This is really not how I imagined I would spend my free time once I got back home. When they had finally returned from their mission 6 days ago, Itaka-sensei had decided to give them 1 week off to allow them to get some rest, and Hinata had looked forward to spending that time with her sister and friends as well as Niji and her uncle. She had even made some plans to meet with Sakura at some point, which was something she would have never imagined possible back during their academy days. Unfortunately, she was far too busy to do all of that. When everything was said and done, she could count herself lucky if she had an hour or two to spare for her sister at the end of the day. And the worst thing was that she brought it all on herself. When she reported the events of her mission, omitting the finer details of how exactly she had beaten Yawaku, of course, as she knew his opinions about her using anything other than Hyuga techniques, as well as their collaboration with Team 7 to her father, he had actually seemed proud of her and vocally approached of her success. Empowered by that, and with her sensei's promise in mind to speak with one of his friends about finding a way to remove the caged bird seal if she just got her hands on the sealing formula, Hinata had used that opportunity to remind him that he had wanted to teach her more about her administrative duties as his heir before her departure and ask whether they could start with these lessons right there and then. He had seemed proud and approving of her apparent desire to live up to her duties, too, and his agreement made her happy as well. Hinata quickly changed her mind when she realized just how much work these lessons actually involved, especially when it turned out that none of them was about the caged bird seal. They would have happened sooner or later anyway, she told herself, so complaining about it was useless. If anything, she should probably count herself happy that they got started with them now when she had nothing else to do, as this meant she didn't have to juggle this with her regular training and lessons, but it was hard to keep that attitude up when every day ended with her eyes burning from staring at numbers for too long and her head throbbing from all the information she was expected to remember. Still, if this was necessary to fulfill her dream, she could bear it. Besides, things were bound to get only easier from here, right? Hinata was jerked out from her thoughts when she felt a familiar presence somewhere nearby, and after taking a few seconds to try and remember who it was, her eyes widened in recognition. Then, uncaring of how much her father would scold her later when he inevitably found out about it, she started running to catch up with the source of the chakra before the person it belonged to could get away. She managed to reach them just outside the compound's gates. "Wait," she exclaimed, cringing inwardly at the volume of her voice. It was late, with the sun having already vanished on the horizon over an hour ago, so raising her voice like this was rather unbecoming of her. Lee had turned around even before she had opened her mouth, having clearly felt her sudden arrival, and at the sight of her, his eyes widened. "Yosh, Hinata-chan. It's good to see you. I wanted to come and see you when Niji mentioned that your team had returned from your mission, but he seemed to believe that it would be too intrusive for some reason, so I refrained. What a happy coincidence to meet you like this." Hinata chuckled, amused, and simultaneously somewhat overwhelmed by his attitude as always. "Don't let him keep you from visiting me," she told him with a smile. "He always worries too much. If I'm really too busy and don't have time, I'd tell you myself. Oh, and make sure to bring Tenten with you as well. I haven't seen her since our teams trained together." He beamed at her with the kind of smile that could make one mistakenly believe that the sun was rising early. "Of course." Then, he frowned. "I will make sure to keep that from Niji, though. I don't think he would be very happy about that, no matter what you say." "Well, he's probably not wrong about that. Did your team just finish training?" "Oh, no," Lee laughed, uncaring about the annoyed looks a few bystanders were throwing at him for his volume and all his worries already forgotten. "We finished training early a few hours ago. Hisashi-san invited us for dinner, you see." He threw a determined fist into the air. "I usually don't like to cut our workouts short, but the food at Niji's is always amazing, so I decided to join in and just do some extra exercise afterwards to make up for it." "That's very admirable," she finally replied after hesitating for a few moments, hoping he didn't see the wobble in her smile. "And a very Lee-like thing to do, too. So did Tenten already leave, then?" "I would have liked to meet her as well." For some reason, that made Lee's bright grin turn into something more akin to a teasing smirk, which Hinata had to admit looked very strange and out of place on his face. "She hasn't left yet. Hisashi-san mentioned that some beautiful flowers had started to bloom in the gardens, and she appeared interested, so Niji volunteered to show them to her." He conspiratorially leaned forward. "Between the two of us, I think they like each other." Against her will, Hinata felt her own lips curve upwards in a similar expression to Lee's, albeit a less extreme version. She very much doubted that this would stay between the two of them, considering Lee had, perhaps even deliberately, although it was always hard to say with him, not lowered his voice at all when he said that, but then again, her cousin's mutual attraction with his teammate was hardly a secret at the Hyuga compound, so it probably didn't really matter. "The flowers are very beautiful," she agreed. Then, she continued more teasingly, "and the setting is very romantic too, especially at night when the only light comes from a few scattered lanterns." Lee gave another hearty laugh. "Then I eagerly look forward to see if this scenery will be enough to make the power of youth within them explode." Almost immediately, Hinata felt her cheeks heat up when she realized how one could interpret that statement in a more indecent manner. The worst thing was that she couldn't tell for the life of her whether Lee had deliberately chosen his words to sound ambiguous or not. His good-natured expression simply gave nothing away, and for the first time, Hinata wondered how much of that expression was the real Lee and how much was him putting on a mask. Anyway, Lee continued cheerfully, either oblivious to her thoughts and embarrassment or simply ignoring them, I really should get going and dash. Wait. Huh. She swallowed while trying to ignore the new surge of embarrassment that burned through her veins. There had been another reason she had wanted to speak with Lee that had nothing to do with making idle small talk, but for all that she had thought about this for a few days now, she had still no idea how to best phrase it. When in doubt, just say it straight ahead, right? Well, you see, I was wondering if you'd mind if I joined you for training sometimes. Lee blinked. You want to train with me? Yes. Hinata said with a quick nod. Niji always tells me about how much it helps him to train with you because your taijutsu style is the exact opposite to our gentle fist, and after my last mission, I realized just how much more I can still grow. I think training with more people would be really helpful, and Niji speaks really highly of your strength, so dash. All right. Lee interrupted her, enthusiastically clenching his fists and mercifully preventing her from rambling on for who knows how long. I'd love to train with you. Such a youthful spirit simply has to be supported, there's no other way. Her face bloomed into a wide smile. Really? Of course. Then, he turned around and began to walk away. Let's go. And that was all it took for her face to fall again. What? I said I added some additional exercises to make up for dinner, didn't I? He asked without slowing down or even just turning his head around. Well, there's no time like the present when it comes to training, so you can join me right now. Right now. But dash. Let's go. With that last exclamation, Lee pushed himself off the ground and began to run ahead. Hinata couldn't do anything but stare after him for a few seconds, too overwhelmed with the sudden turn of events to react, but then, with only a short backwards glance, she began rushing after Lee while using her Byakugan to keep track of him. She was technically wearing indoor clothes ill-suited for training, but that couldn't be helped now. There was clearly no time for her to get changed. Or to notify her father, for that matter, but she was optimistic that one of the guards who had not so subtle listened in on their conversation would report to him before soon. I really hope this wasn't actually a terrible idea. I can't believe you forced me out here. Itaka fondly rolled his eyes at Anko's sullen comment, not bothering to hide his amusement in the slightest as the two of them walked through the busy streets of Konoha. I'm sure your past self would thank me, or do you think you from a few years ago would approve of you spending all your free time in that laboratory of yours? I'm sure my past self would understand if she knew the reason why I'm doing that. She scoffed as she said that, but judging by the fact that she looked everywhere but his face, Itaka was reasonably sure she knew what nonsense it was that she was speaking. Even if she heard that you wouldn't even budge when someone offered to invite you to some free dango. All he got in response was some incomprehensible grumbling. He could have continued to tease her there and then, but as he felt generous today and didn't want to risk annoying her to the point where she actually turned around and walked away when he already got her this far, he decided against it. However, it seemed Anko wasn't quite done yet after all. Well, perhaps I would have been more open to the idea if I didn't have to worry about any ulterior motives on your part. When Itaki rolled his eyes this time, it was more of an exasperated gesture than a fondly one earlier. And what ulterior motives might I possibly have, he asked, deciding, perhaps against his better judgment, to play along. As expected, Anko's entire demeanor immediately brightened when given the opportunity to fool around. Oh, I don't know, she said, hugging herself as if seeking comfort in an uncomfortable situation and speaking with an innocent voice that was obviously fake. A young man inviting a beautiful woman to grab something to eat together. I wonder what ulterior motives could be behind such a thing. Then, at his very unimpressed look, she compromised, or you could just want to get some dango yourself but are too embarrassed to enter the shop all by your lonesome or something like that, I guess. That was still nonsense, of course, but as that was preferable to her first idea, he decided to run with it. Perhaps there's a grain of truth in that, Itaka said thoughtfully, making Anko whirl her head around to give him a suspicious look. Very well, I suppose it might have been wrong of me to force you to come with me like this. Maybe I should have instead asked my team dash. Alright, it's fine. Anko interrupted him before he could finish. I get it, okay? No need to send me packing when we're already almost there. And all it took was to threaten her that she wouldn't get any free dango, he thought with amusement, although he made sure that none of it could be seen on his face. Anyway, when will I finally get to meet these brats of yours? It has been, what, 2 months since you started training them? 3? Why haven't you introduced them to me yet? Primarily because you spend most of your time in a top security laboratory one can't enter without proper authorization, he replied dryly, resulting in her rolling his eyes. Secondarily, well, I suppose there have been other things that took priority. Anko let out an exaggerated gasp. More important things than meeting me? Yes. Whatever act she was trying to pull off fell apart when his monotonous answer sent her into a laughing fit. Seriously, though, she said once she had pulled herself together again. I want to meet them. Especially that Hyuga girl, considering what you want me to do. He nodded, ignoring the almost impossible to discern accusation underneath her words. That reaction was only understandable, and it was certainly much tamer than her first reaction when he approached her with that particular favor. Not that he could blame her. Asking someone to mess with and get involved in such sensitive clan business was asking for a lot, but add Itaka's other request to it and it was almost no, scratch that. It was rude to ask so much from another person, friend, and former teammate or not. There was no almost about it. After checking that no one was listening to them, not exactly an easy task considering they were walking in the middle of a busy street, mind you, at the moment, he said in a somewhat quieter voice, her father hasn't taught her the caged bird seal yet. Once he does, I dash. Yeah, that's not what I mean, Anko interrupted him, not bothering to lower her voice as well. Although to be fair, she clearly chose her words carefully enough so that even if someone were to listen to them, they would have no idea what they were talking about. That thing notwithstanding, I just want to meet them. Preferable sometime soon. Knowing when to give up, Itaka merely sighed. I will see what can be arranged. Yeah, see that you do. Arranging such a meeting might actually hit 2 birds with 1 stone. Not only would it make Anko happy, which in turn would stop her from bothering him too much, but it would also give him the opportunity to arrange a training session for his team with a new opponent to spar against. Furthermore, it was a good way to get Anko out of her laboratory, so there was that as well. No matter how often she insisted that she was at the edge of a breakthrough in her research, it wouldn't do her any good to ponder over her experiments all the time. Sometimes, one needed to take a break and occupy oneself with other things in order to let their brain get some rest. That was the easiest way to solve seemingly impossible problems. Just getting some distance from them for a bit before looking at them again later from a different perspective could do wonders. Anko's voice pulled him back into the present. Speaking of other people I have yet to meet, she drawled with a teasing grin, making Itaka almost unconsciously narrow his eyes at her. I recently heard the funniest story about a pretty Inyazuka girl visiting your place after dark. Anything you want to tell me? Wonderful, he thought with a tinge of annoyance. First Kiba, and now Anko as well. The only one missing now is Shisui. Then, another thought nearly made him grimace. Or worse, my mother. And how exactly did you hear about that when you never leave your lab? The overly proud grin she shot him in response was, in his opinion, entirely unnecessary. I might not leave the lab, but Shizun does, and she's a big gossip. Believe me, I know everything that happens in this village. Not just unnecessary, he mentally added, but misguided as well. That's not something to be proud of. In that case you should know that Hana only came to tell me that her brother, one of my students, wouldn't participate in the team's training for a while because of some Inyazuka intern matters. Ah, but maybe that's just what you two want everyone to believe. Who knows what truly happened behind closed doors, eh? At this point, Itaka decided that replying would get him nowhere. Anko would just find a way to twist all his words against him. Not that it was very difficult in this particular situation, mind you. Now that she mentioned it, Itaka supposed he could see why people might get the wrong impression from her visiting him like that, especially because most people just loved to gossip and therefore had no problem with intentionally misinterpreting things to spice things up. And speaking of gossip, Anko said she heard about the visit from Shizun, who was apparently a big gossip. Did that mean the rest of the village was talking about that as well? With another exasperated sigh, Itaka pinched the bridge of his nose, for once not caring what other people might think. I have to prepare for Shisui to come and visit me as soon as he gets back from his mission, don't I? Check the description for the links to the author.